You think loyalty buys safety? That standing by your pack guarantees they'll stand by you when the wolves come circling? King Vaelor Duskbane learned different. The man who conquered kingdoms, who made emperors kneel, who believed the crown made him untouchable, he discovered that power protects everything except the heart. And when desire crossed paths with duty in the marble halls of Nightthorn, when forbidden attraction became catastrophe, the empire didn't just crack, it bled. This is the story of a king who lost everything because he forgot one savage truth. You can own a throne, but you can't own a soul. Stay with me until the end of this one. You're going to want to see how far a man will fall when he mistakes conquest for love. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. Let me know where my tribe's watching from tonight. The northern wind carried ash and the smell of burning cedar through Nightthorn's capital, a sprawling monument to domination built from black marble and ambition. The palace rose against winter skies like a dagger pointed at the throat of heaven, its silver banners snapping in the cold with the sound of whips cracking. This was an empire forged in blood, held together by fear, and ruled by a man who believed mercy was just another word for weakness. King Vaelor Duskbane stood at the eastern balcony overlooking his city, watching smoke rise from the military forges below. He was 43, lean and scarred, with eyes the color of storm clouds and a face that had forgotten how to soften. War had carved him into something efficient and cold. His hands, calloused and marked with old blade wounds, rested on the stone railing with the same weight they rested on throats during interrogations. Behind him, the throne room stretched vast and empty, lit by chandeliers that threw shadows across walls decorated with the captured banners of defeated kingdoms. 17 years he'd ruled, 17 years of putting down rebellions, executing traitors, and teaching the northern territories that defiance ended in mass graves. A crown survives through control. That's what his father had whispered before dying, and Vaelor had built his entire philosophy around that single principle. Queen Cerys Duskbane entered without announcement, her footsteps precise against the polished floor. She wore midnight blue, her dark hair pulled back severe, her beauty the kind that demanded distance rather than desire. Their marriage had been tactical from the beginning, her family's eastern territories for his military protection, an alliance sealed with vows that meant everything to the empire and nothing to the heart. Stand next to each other long enough, Vaelor thought, and people stop noticing you never actually touch. The southern commanders arrive at sunset, Cerys said, her voice carrying the practiced neutrality of someone who'd learned early that emotion was ammunition. Lord Cassian Vane rides with them. He's brought his new wife. Vaelor didn't turn. You've reviewed the strategic proposals? Of course. Cassian wants to push the border campaigns another 50 miles into the disputed territories. He's requesting 3 additional legions and supply lines through the mountain passes. She paused, and in that pause lived 15 years of careful distance. He's also requesting your formal blessing of his marriage. Apparently it matters to him. Everything matters to Cassian. That's why he's useful. That's why he's dangerous, Cerys corrected, but softly, the way you mention a crack in the foundation that hasn't collapsed the house yet. Loyalty that complete always wants something in return, even if the man hasn't figured out what yet. Vaelor finally turned to look at his wife, this woman he'd shared a palace with for over a decade without ever really knowing. She met his gaze the way she always did, steady, unreadable, a negotiation that never quite concluded. You think I should worry about Cassian? I think you should worry about the fact that you never worry about anything until it's already bleeding. She smoothed her gown, a gesture that meant the conversation was ending. The banquet is prepared. Try to look less like you're sentencing them all to death. She left, and Vaelor returned to watching his empire, wondering not for the first time if this was what victory was supposed to feel like. A kingdom at your feet and a cold throne to sit on alone. Isan. The banquet hall that evening glittered with the forced pageantry of power maintaining its own mythology. Long tables stretched beneath vaulted ceilings, loaded with enough food to feed a village for a month, surrounded by nobles who smiled with their mouths while their eyes did the math on who was rising and who was about to fall. Musicians played something elegant and forgettable. Wine flowed like the empire expected it to, abundant, expensive, numbing. Vaelor sat at the head table, Cerys beside him radiating perfect composure, both of them playing their roles in this theater of dominance. He'd given the required speech welcoming the Southern commanders, praised their victories, reminded everyone in the room that the crown's reach extended as far as its sword arm, and that sword arm never tired. Lord Cassian Vane stood when introduced, and the room responded with genuine respect. He was 38, built like violence waiting to happen, with sun-darkened skin and a face marked by campaigns that had earned every scar. His armor had been replaced by formal attire, but he wore it like it still chafed, a warrior uncomfortable anywhere except a battlefield. "Your Majesty," Cassian began, his voice carrying the rough edges of a man who'd shouted orders through sandstorms and arrow storms both. "I come not only as your commander, but as a man seeking your blessing. I've brought my wife, Lady Elira Vane, to be presented to the throne and to the kingdom she now serves through our union." The room shifted attention like a predator turning its head toward movement, and then she stepped forward. Vaelor felt it before he saw her completely, a disturbance in the atmosphere, the way air changes pressure before lightning strikes. Lady Elira Vane wore silver dark silk that moved like smoke when she walked. Not the desperate peacock display most court women favored, but something understated and therefore more devastating. Her hair was dark, pulled back to reveal a face that wasn't trying to be beautiful and succeeded anyway. But it was her eyes that hit him first, gray-green, intelligent, and completely unimpressed. She approached the throne with measured steps, and when she reached the required distance for formal acknowledgement, she didn't lower her gaze the way every other person in this room had learned to. She looked at him. Really looked. Not with fear, not with ambition, with recognition. Like she saw past the crown, past the reputation, straight through to something he'd forgotten existed. Vaelor felt his chest tighten, felt something shift in his gut that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with danger. "Your Majesty," Elira said, and her voice carried the kind of quiet confidence that didn't need volume to fill space. "I'm honored to stand before the throne that my husband has defended with his life. I hope to serve this empire with the same devotion, though perhaps with different weapons." It was a perfectly appropriate statement, courteous, measured, but the way she held his stare while saying it made every word feel like a challenge. Cassian beamed beside her, proud and oblivious, a man who'd finally found the missing piece to his life and wanted his king to witness his completeness. "Lady Elira," Vaelor replied, his voice steady through sheer will, "your reputation precedes you. I'm told you were educated in the Eastern academies, that you speak 4 languages and have studied philosophy and warfare both." "I've studied survival, Your Majesty. The rest is just different applications of the same principle." Something in the room shifted. The nobles pretended not to notice, but they noticed. Cerys noticed too. Vaelor felt her attention sharpen beside him like a blade being drawn slowly from its sheath. "And what principle is that?" Vaelor asked, aware he was engaging longer than protocol required, unable to stop himself. "That power protects nothing except itself. Everything else requires something more difficult to maintain." "Which is?" "Worth." The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. Cassian laughed, warm and unaware. "My wife believes in virtue, Your Majesty. I keep telling her the Empire runs on strength, but she insists there's a difference." "There is," Elira said quietly, still holding Vaelor's gaze. "One builds kingdoms. The other makes them worth defending." The king who had silenced rebellions with mass executions, who had never flinched from cruelty when it served the throne, found himself momentarily without response. Not because he agreed, because some part of him, some deeply buried part he'd thought dead, recognized the truth even as it threatened everything he'd built his rule upon. He granted the formal blessing, praised Cassian's service, made the appropriate gestures. But when Elira and Cassian withdrew to their places at the table, Vaelor felt the echo of that encounter resonating in his chest, like the first crack in a dam that's held for too long. Cerys leaned close. Her words meant only for him. "Be careful." "Of what?" "Whatever you're already thinking." "Of what?" 3 weeks became a kind of slow-motion catastrophe. Vaelor told himself he was simply evaluating the Southern command structure, that his increased attention to military matters involving Cassian's legions was strategic necessity. He called meetings, reviewed reports, requested detailed briefings on border security, and each time he found reasons for Elira to be present. It started legitimately. She had insights into the Eastern territories where she'd been raised, understood supply chain logistics in ways that proved genuinely useful. Cassian was proud to have his wife's intelligence recognized, kept praising her contributions, kept thanking Vaelor for including her in matters of state. The fool had no idea he was handing his wife over piece by piece. The conversation started professional. Troop movements, resource allocation, political alliances with merchant guilds. Then they shifted. One afternoon in the palace library, surrounded by military histories and maps marked with past campaigns, Alira challenged one of Vaelor's proposed strategies for expanding into neutral territories. "This will cost you more than you'll gain," she said, pointing to the supply lines marked in red across the map. "You'll hold the land for maybe 2 seasons before the locals bleed you dry through resistance. Then you'll have to commit more forces to hold what you stole, which means you can't respond to actual threats elsewhere. This isn't conquest, it's slow suicide." Vaelor stared at the map, then at her. "You think I should show weakness? Let them believe the Empire can be resisted? I think you should learn the difference between strength and obsession with appearing strong. They're not the same thing. One makes you powerful, the other makes you predictable." "And which am I?" Alira met his eyes with that same unnerving directness. "You tell me. When was the last time you changed a strategy because it was wrong instead of because it failed?" No one spoke to him like this. No one. He should have had her removed from the council sessions, should have restricted her access, reminded everyone that she was the wife of a commander, not a commander herself. Instead, he kept calling her back, because she was right. About the strategy, about the difference between strength and the appearance of it, about the fact that he'd surrounded himself with people too afraid to tell him anything except what they thought he wanted to hear. And because when she challenged him, something in his chest woke up that had been sleeping for years. Another meeting, this time in the Eastern Gallery after a formal council session had concluded. The other advisors had left. Cassian had been called to address a supply dispute in the barracks. Vaelor should have dismissed Alira too. He didn't. They stood near the tall windows overlooking the frozen gardens, twilight turning everything blue-gray and cold. "Why did you marry him?" Vaelor asked, the question emerging before he could stop it. Alira turned from the window. "Because he's a good man. Because he loves me without conditions. Because after watching what power does to people, I wanted something simple." "And is it simple?" She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Nothing simple when you bring it into a palace. You could have stayed in the Eastern territories, lived quietly, avoided all this." He gestured vaguely at the throne room visible through the doorway, at the empire beyond. "Could have," she agreed. "But I made a choice. Choices have consequences. Everything has consequences, Your Majesty. The difference is whether you're brave enough to face them." She moved toward the door, preparing to leave, and Vaelor felt something close to panic. An unfamiliar sensation for a man who'd faced down armies without flinching. "You think I'm a coward?" he asked, his voice rougher than intended. Alira paused in the doorway, looking back. "I think you're a king who's forgotten what he's afraid of. That's more dangerous than cowardice, because at least cowards know what they're running from." She left, and Vaelor stood alone in the gallery, staring at nothing, feeling the foundations of his carefully controlled world beginning to shift beneath his feet. Cassian noticed nothing. That was the worst part. He continued his duties with the same loyal efficiency, continued praising his king, continued being grateful that Vaelor valued his wife's intelligence enough to include her in strategic planning. He talked about how blessed he was, how the years of war had finally given him something worth fighting for, how he'd spent his whole life serving the throne, and now he had someone to come home to when the battles ended. His trust was absolute, which made what was growing between Vaelor and Alira something darker than simple adultery. This was betrayal at its most intimate, not just of marriage vows, but of the loyalty that held empires together. Cerys, however, was not blind. She appeared in Vaelor's private chambers one night after he'd returned late from another extended council session. He was still dressed, standing by the window, and he knew before she spoke that this conversation had been coming. "How long are you planning to continue this?" Cerys asked, closing the door behind her with deliberate calm. "Continue what?" "Don't insult us both with feigned ignorance. You're not stupid, and neither am I. The question is whether you're reckless enough to let this destroy everything you've built. Vaelor turned to face his wife, this woman he'd shared a crown with but never a heart. You think I'm having an affair? I think you're walking toward one, which is possibly worse. Affairs can be hidden. Whatever this is, it's being witnessed by half the court. She moved closer, her expression not angry, but coldly analytical. Cassian Vane commands the Southern Legions. His loyalty is the spine of your military power. If you humiliate him publicly, if you betray him with his wife, he won't just leave. He'll burn everything on his way out. You assume I can't control this. I assume you don't want to. That's the problem. Ceres studied him with the same detached precision she brought to everything. For 17 years, you've been perfectly disciplined. You've sacrificed comfort for control, desire for strategy, and now some woman who speaks back to you has made you forget why that discipline mattered. She's not just some woman. The words escaped before Vaelor could cage them, and Ceres's expression shifted, not with hurt, because hurt would have required investment she'd never made in this marriage, but with recognition of how far gone he already was. Then you're already lost, she said quietly, and when you fall, you'll take the empire with you. She left without waiting for response, and Vaelor returned to the window, watching night settle over Nightthorn like a threat he could feel but not yet name. The shift from professional distance to something else happened during the winter solstice, in the abandoned royal sanctuary beneath the palace. These chambers had been built generations ago for kings preparing for war, places where strategy could be planned without the performance of court life, where vulnerability could exist without undermining authority. They'd been forgotten over time, relegated to storage and dust, until Vaelor had them cleared for what he'd told himself were security briefings. Elira had questioned why they were meeting in a location so removed from official council chambers. Vaelor had offered some excuse about confidentiality. Both of them knew it was a lie. The sanctuary was lit by oil lamps that threw shadows across stone walls, carved with the names of ancient rulers. A table held maps and reports that neither of them had touched in the last hour. The air smelled of old cedar and the kind of silence that made every breath audible. "This is where you bring me to discuss troop movements?" Elira asked, standing near the wall inscriptions, her voice carrying an edge that wasn't quite anger. "This is where I bring you so we can stop pretending," Vaelor replied. She turned to face him fully. "Stop pretending what?" "That this is about strategy. That I call these meetings because I value your insights into territorial disputes. That I'm not counting minutes between conversations. That I don't—" He stopped, the confession catching in his throat like glass. "That you don't what?" Elira's voice had gone quieter, but not softer. There was steel underneath. "Say it. You're a king who orders executions before breakfast. You should be able to finish a sentence about your own desires." "That I don't think about you constantly," Vaelor finished, the words coming out rough. "That I don't spend council sessions watching how you tear apart bad strategies instead of listening to what's being discussed. That I don't lie awake in chambers I share with a wife I don't love and wonder what the hell you've done to me." The silence that followed felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing the fall would kill you, but unable to step back. Elira's expression shifted through several emotions. Surprise, something that might have been fear, and then something harder to name. "You think this is love? This is obsession. This is a man who's controlled everything for so long that the first person who refuses to bow becomes a challenge you can't resist." "Maybe," Vaelor admitted, moving closer despite every instinct screaming this was the moment to retreat. "Or maybe you're the first real thing I've encountered in 20 years of performance. Every word, every gesture, every decision I make is calculated for effect. But when you challenge me, when you look at me like I'm not a crown but a man, I remember what it felt like before I became this." "Before you became what? Powerful?" "Before I became empty." The word landed between them like something broken. Elira's composure cracked slightly. "I love my husband." "I know. He's loyal to you. He'd die for you." "I know that too." "Then why are you doing this? Why are you ruining something good just because you finally feel something?" Vaelor stopped moving, the question hitting harder than he'd expected. "Because feeling anything is better than feeling nothing. Because I've spent my entire reign believing that control was enough, that dominance replaced connection, that if I just held tight enough to power, I wouldn't notice I was alone." He met her eyes. And then you walked into my throne room and looked at me like I was human, and I realized I'd been dying slowly for years without noticing. That's not my responsibility to fix. No, he agreed. It's not. But that doesn't change what's happening. Elira moved toward the door, but slowly, like part of her was fighting the other part. This ends, now, before it becomes something neither of us can take back. It already has. She stopped at the threshold, her back to him, shoulders tense. You're asking me to betray a good man because you're bored with being a god. That's not romance, Your Majesty. That's cruelty disguised as vulnerability. Then leave, Vaelor said, knowing he shouldn't push, unable to stop. Walk out. Go back to your simple life with your loyal husband. Pretend you don't feel this too. Elira turned back, and her eyes were bright with something between fury and anguish. You think because I argue with you, because I don't flinch from your reputation, that means I want this? You don't know anything about me. I know you're still here. It was the cruelest truth either of them had spoken. She crossed the space between them in 4 steps, and when she reached him, her hand came up fast. Not to strike, but to grip the front of his tunic like she was drowning, and he was the only thing solid enough to hold on to. I hate you, she said, and her voice broke on the words. I know. This will destroy everything. I know. He'll never forgive either of us. I know. And then she kissed him, and it was nothing like the romantic surrenders described in poets' lies. It was desperate and angry, and tasted like guilt and inevitability. It was 2 people who knew better choosing catastrophe anyway, because sometimes the heart makes demands that reason can't negotiate with. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Elira looked at him with eyes full of horror at what they'd just crossed. This can't happen again, she whispered. It will, Vaelor replied, because lying would have been worse than the truth. She fled the sanctuary, leaving him alone with the names of dead kings carved into stone and the certainty that he'd just set fire to his own empire for a few minutes of feeling alive. But it did happen again, and again. The meetings continued under increasingly thin pretexts. The sanctuary beneath the palace became their crucible, a place where the performance of power could be abandoned and the raw truth underneath could breathe. They talked for hours, about philosophy, about the difference between ruling and terrorizing, about what it costs to maintain control versus what it costs to actually connect with another human being. Elira challenged every assumption Vaelor had built his reign on, and instead of defending himself, he found himself examining the foundations and realizing how many cracks had formed. But they also fell further into something that had no clean name. Not love, exactly. Love suggested something pure and redemptive. This was recognition, the terrible intimacy of being completely seen. Cassian remained oblivious, his trust so complete it had become a weapon neither of them knew how to disarm. The court, however, began to notice. Whispers moved through the palace like winter wind through cracks in stone. Servants talked. Minor nobles calculated odds. Ministers positioned themselves for whatever was coming, because when kings made mistakes this visible, the empire rearranged itself around the damage. Queen Cerys watched everything with the patience of someone who'd learned long ago that power rewarded those who waited for the perfect moment to strike. She didn't confront Vaelor again, didn't issue warnings or ultimatums. She gathered evidence, letters documenting the unusual frequency of council sessions involving Lady Elira, testimonies from guards about late-night movements in restricted sections of the palace, detailed logs of when Cassian was conveniently absent from court, and when his king and his wife were conveniently together. Cerys was building a case not for divorce or scandal. She was building ammunition for war. The revelation came during a formal military briefing 6 weeks after that first kiss. Cassian had been presenting updated strategies for the spring campaign, standing before assembled commanders and nobles in the main war room, his voice confident and strong. He spoke about honor, about defending the empire, about the privilege of serving a throne that had kept the northern territories stable for nearly 2 decades. He believed every word, and while he spoke, a sealed letter arrived for him, delivered by a servant whose neutral expression suggested they knew exactly what they were carrying. Cassian paused mid-sentence, broke the seal, and began reading. Vaelor watched the color drain from his commander's face. watched faith die in real time as words on parchment destroyed what years of battle couldn't touch. The letter was from Ceres, brief and surgical, containing dates, locations, witness accounts. It didn't speculate, didn't embellish, just presented the evidence that his wife and his king had been meeting in secret, repeatedly, with increasing frequency and decreasing plausibility of innocent explanation. Cassian looked up from the letter, and his eyes found Vaelor across the war room. The question in them was worse than accusation. Tell me this isn't true. Tell me I'm misunderstanding. Tell me the queen is lying because she wants to damage you politically. Vaelor said nothing, because there were no words that could unsay what had happened, no justification that wouldn't sound like exactly what it was. A man who'd taken what he wanted without considering the cost. Cassian folded the letter carefully, precisely, like he was performing surgery on something already dead. Then he turned and walked out of the war room without speaking, his footsteps echoing against stone with the finality of doors closing that would never open again. The room erupted in carefully controlled chaos, commanders looking at each other, nobles suddenly remembering they had other places to be, the whole apparatus of power recognizing that something fundamental had just fractured. Vaelor stood frozen at the head of the table, staring at the doorway Cassian had disappeared through, feeling the empire begin to crack beneath his feet. Ceres appeared beside him, her voice low enough that only he could hear. You were warned. Then she left too, leaving Vaelor alone with the maps and strategies and the sudden certainty that loyalty, once broken, didn't just wound, it metastasized into something far worse. Whoosh! Cassian vanished from court that night. His personal guard reported that he'd taken a horse and ridden south without explanation, still wearing his formal military attire, moving fast like something was chasing him. Elira came to Vaelor's private chambers near midnight, her face pale and her composure completely shattered. He knows, she said, the words barely audible. Ceres told him everything. I know. What did you think would happen? That we could just keep doing this and no one would notice? That a man like Cassian would just accept being humiliated by the two people he trusted most? Vaelor poured wine with hands that were steadier than they should have been. I thought I could control it. You can't control feelings. That's the whole problem. You've spent so long believing dominance works on everything that you forgot some things can't be conquered. Then what do we do? Elira laughed, and the sound held no humor, only anguish. We? There is no we. There was never a we. There was just you wanting something you couldn't have, and me being stupid enough to let it matter. You're saying you regret it. I'm saying I loved my husband, and now he's gone, and I don't know if he's coming back, and even if he does, he'll never look at me the same way. Her voice cracked. You took that from both of us. You took his faith and my integrity, and you replaced it with whatever this is, and now we're all paying the price. Vaelor set down his wine. I didn't force you. No. You just made yourself vulnerable enough that I couldn't resist trying to save you from yourself. That's almost worse. She moved toward the door. The Southern commanders are loyal to Cassian. If he decides you betrayed him, and you did, they'll follow him. Not you. Him. Because loyalty isn't about crowns, Your Majesty. It's about trust. And you just destroyed the only man who gave you that without conditions. She left, and Vaelor stood alone in his chambers, surrounded by luxury and power, feeling the first tremors of something he hadn't experienced in years. Fear. Not of battle. Not of political maneuvering. Fear that he'd finally made a mistake too large to survive. Dick. 3 days later, reports arrived from the southern territories. Cassian had reached his legions. He wasn't marching north toward the palace, but he wasn't disbanding his forces either. He was waiting. And in that waiting lived a question that echoed through every command post, every noble house, every strategic calculation in the empire. What does a loyal soldier do when the man he served betrays him in the most intimate way possible? The answer came a week later, delivered by a messenger who rode hard enough to kill 2 horses getting to Nightthorn. Lord Cassian Vaelor, commander of the Southern Legions, was formally withdrawing his oath of loyalty to King Vaelor Duskbane, not because of treason, not because of political ambition. Because trust, once broken, couldn't be commanded back into existence. And if a king couldn't honor loyalty when it mattered most, then that king had forfeited the right to demand it from others. The southern legions, 12,000 men who'd bled for the empire, who'd held borders against invasion, who'd believed they were serving something worth dying for, were no longer under crown authority. The messenger stood in the throne room delivering this news while nobles and ministers watched, calculating how quickly they needed to shift allegiances, how much damage control was possible, whether this was the beginning of civil war or just the empire's slow collapse. Vaelor listened to every word, his expression carved from stone, refusing to show anything that could be interpreted as weakness. But inside, behind the carefully maintained facade of control, something fundamental was breaking. Not the loss of the legions, though that was catastrophic enough. The loss of certainty. For 17 years, he'd believed that power made him invincible, that as long as he held the crown firmly enough, nothing could truly hurt him. He'd been wrong. And now the empire he'd built on dominance and fear was beginning to fracture, not because of external enemies, but because he'd forgotten that some things, loyalty, trust, honor, couldn't be taken by force. They had to be earned, and he'd just spent them like they were infinite resources instead of the fragile bonds that held everything together. The messenger finished delivering Cassian's message and waited for response. Vaelor stood from his throne, descended the steps slowly, and addressed not just the messenger but every person in the throne room, every lord and commander who was watching to see what happened when a king's control began slipping. Tell Lord Cassian that his withdrawal is noted. Tell him the empire doesn't negotiate with threats. And tell him, Vaelor paused, choosing words carefully, knowing they would be repeated, analyzed, weaponized. Tell him that loyalty works both directions, and if he believes I betrayed him, perhaps he should consider what he's betraying now. It was a political response, strategic, designed to frame the narrative before Cassian could, but it was also hollow, and everyone in the room knew it. The messenger bowed and departed, and Vaelor returned to his throne, sitting in state while the empire he'd controlled so tightly began unraveling in his hands, wondering at what point dominance stopped being strength and became just another kind of prison. That night, alone in the sanctuary beneath the palace, where this had all started, Vaelor stood among the names of dead kings and confronted a truth he'd spent his entire reign avoiding. A crown could command armies, it could execute enemies, it could enforce order through fear and violence and the machinery of power. But it couldn't make someone love you freely. It couldn't repair trust once shattered. It couldn't undo the moment when desire crossed into betrayal and everything you'd built began burning. And the worst part, the part that made his hand shake as he gripped the edge of the map table, was knowing that even now, even with the empire fracturing, even with Cassian's loyalty transformed into justified rage, he'd do it again. Because those hours with Elira, those conversations where he could be human instead of crown, where someone saw him completely and didn't flinch, they'd been the only real thing he'd felt in 20 years. And that realization, more than anything, told him exactly how lost he already was. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. The door opened. Queen Ceres stood silhouetted against torchlight, and her expression carried something Vaelor had never seen from her before. Not anger, not satisfaction at being proven right. Pity. The southern territories are mobilizing, she said quietly. Cassian isn't just withdrawing support. He's preparing for war. Vaelor nodded slowly, unsurprised. How long do we have? Weeks, maybe less. The question isn't whether he'll march on Nightthorn. The question is whether anyone will stand with you when he does. You could stop this, Vaelor said. Use your family's influence in the eastern territories. Broker a negotiation. Why would I? Ceres asked, not cruelly, but with genuine curiosity. You destroyed your most loyal commander for an affair that couldn't even become a real relationship. You sacrificed stability for feeling something. This isn't tragedy, Vaelor. This is just consequences. She turned to leave, then paused at the threshold. For what it's worth, I almost understand it. Almost. The need to feel human instead of just powerful. But understanding doesn't change reality. You're a king. You don't get to choose personal happiness over the empire. That was always the bargain. And if I refuse that bargain now? Ceres looked back at him with something approaching sympathy. Then you'll learn what every ruler eventually discovers. The crown protects everything except the person wearing it. She left, and Vaelor stood alone in the sanctuary, feeling winter seep through stone walls, knowing that somewhere south of the capital, A man he'd betrayed was gathering forces not for conquest, but for judgment. The empire he'd held together through control was about to tear itself apart. And he'd done it to himself. Not through weakness. Through the cruelest irony of all, finally feeling something real in a life built on calculated distance, and discovering too late that some prices are too high to pay, no matter how desperately you want what you're buying. The question now wasn't whether he'd survive. It was whether anything would. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it the kind of cold that crept through stone walls and settled in bones. Snow fell over Nightthorn in thick silence, covering the city like a shroud being drawn over something already dying. The palace continued its daily rituals. Guards changed shifts, servants maintained fires, nobles performed their calculated dances of ambition, but underneath the performance, everyone could feel it. The empire was holding its breath. Vaelor stopped sleeping, not from guilt, though that lived in his chest like a blade slowly turning. Not from fear, though reports from the south grew darker each day. He stopped sleeping because the moment his eyes closed, he saw Cassian's face in that war room, watching Faith die in real time. And no amount of strategic planning could erase that image. Here's something people don't understand about power until they've held it completely. Dominance doesn't prepare you for the moment when you realize you've destroyed the one person who actually believed in you. Kings learn to expect hatred from enemies. They learn to manage ambition from allies. But genuine loyalty, the kind Cassian had offered without conditions for 15 years, that's rare enough that when you break it, you feel the fracture in ways conquest never taught you to handle. The crown teaches you how to win. It doesn't teach you how to live with what winning costs. Lord Marshal Theron Cale appeared in the king's private study 3 nights after Cassian's withdrawal, his weathered face carrying the kind of weariness that came from watching empires make predictable mistakes. He was 60, gray-bearded, with eyes that had seen enough campaigns to recognize the difference between tactical retreat and collapse. He didn't bow, didn't observe formal protocol, just closed the door and spoke plain. Your Majesty, we need to discuss reality. Vaelor looked up from military reports he'd been pretending to read. Go ahead. The southern legions have moved to defensive positions along the Redstone Pass. Cassian isn't marching yet, but he's positioned perfectly to cut off our supply routes if this turns into open conflict. The man learned siege warfare from you. He knows exactly where we're vulnerable. How many commanders will hold? Theron moved to the map table, studied the markers representing troop positions across the Empire. Honestly, maybe half. The Eastern Lords are watching to see which way this breaks. The northern garrisons will hold because they have no choice, but their loyalty is geographic, not personal. The real question is the Central Territories. They've been stable because they feared you, but fear only works until it doesn't. Vaelor stood, moved to face the Marshal directly. You're saying I've lost control. I'm saying control was an illusion that worked until you reminded everyone you're human. Kings aren't supposed to make mistakes this visible. They're not supposed to betray their most loyal men for passion. You broke the mythology, and now people are reconsidering whether the crown's worth defending. And what would you do? In my position, Theron met his gaze without flinching. I'd never be in your position, Your Majesty, because I learned early that you can't rule an empire and still feel like a person. You choose one or the other. You tried to have both, and now we're watching what happens when that math doesn't work. It was the most honest assessment anyone had given Vaelor in years, and it landed like a fist to the chest. How long before Cassian moves? Weeks. Maybe less. He's not just angry, he's tactical. He'll wait until the weather breaks, until supply lines are stretched, until he's sure he can actually win. This isn't rebellion. It's judgment. And the thing about judgment, Your Majesty, is it doesn't negotiate. Then we prepare for war. Theron nodded slowly, but his expression carried no confidence. We prepare. But understand what we're preparing for. This isn't external invasion. This is civil war. Brother against brother, the Empire bleeding itself because you couldn't keep your hands off another man's wife. The words were brutal enough that Vaelor's hand moved instinctively toward the sword he wasn't wearing, muscle memory from years of silencing disrespect with violence. Theron didn't flinch, and that more than anything showed Vaelor exactly how far his authority had eroded. Get the northern garrisons ready, Vaelor said finally, his voice colder than he felt. Reinforce the mountain passes. Send diplomatic envoys to the Eastern Lords with promises of increased territory and trade concessions. We hold the capital. We control the narrative. And Lady Elira? Vaelor's jaw tightened. What about her? She's still in the palace. Cassian's wife, your whatever she is. She's a political liability and a personal weakness. The smart move is to send her back south. Let Cassian have her back as a gesture of de-escalation. No. The word came out harder than intended, and Theron's expression shifted to something approaching pity. Your Majesty, this is exactly the problem. You're making decisions with your heart instead of your head. That's fine for poets. It's suicide for kings. I said no. Theron studied him for a long moment, then shook his head slightly. Then prepare for the consequences. Because Cassian isn't just coming for the throne. He's coming for justice. And men fighting for justice are more dangerous than men fighting for conquest. The marshal left, and Vaelor returned to the window, watching snow fall over a city that had always feared him and was now beginning to question whether fear was enough. Mas. Elira stayed, not because Vaelor commanded it, though technically he could have, not because she had nowhere else to go, though leaving would have meant facing Cassian's rage and the shame of what they'd done. She stayed because guilt had a gravity all its own, and some sins demanded that you stand in the wreckage and watch what you'd broken. She appeared in the eastern gallery on the fourth night after Cassian's withdrawal, finding Vaelor standing among the tall windows overlooking frozen gardens where moonlight turned everything silver and desolate. You should eat, she said quietly. I'm not hungry. That's not the same as not needing to eat. Vaelor turned to face her, and the exhaustion in his expression was naked enough that for a moment the armor of kingship fell away completely. What are we doing, Elira? What the hell are we doing? She moved closer, but stopped short of touching, maintaining distance, like it might retroactively create boundaries they'd already destroyed. We're trying to figure out how to live with what we did. That's all anyone can do after they make choices this catastrophic. I don't regret it. The confession escaped before he could cage it, and Elira's face twisted with something between pain and fury. You should. We destroyed a good man because we were selfish enough to believe our feelings mattered more than his trust. They did matter. They do matter. To us. But here's what you still don't understand, Vaelor. We're not the only people who exist. Our feelings, our needs, our desperate desire to feel something real. None of that makes what we did acceptable. It just makes us human. And sometimes being human isn't enough justification. Then why are you still here? The question hung between them like a challenge. Elira's composure cracked slightly. Because I don't know where else to be. Because going back to him would be cowardice, and staying with you is impossible. And I'm trapped between two versions of myself that can't coexist. The woman who loved her husband and meant her vows, and the woman who looked at you and felt something she couldn't control. You think love is something you can control? I think we should have tried harder. Elira's voice rose slightly, years of practiced composure fracturing. I think you were a king who'd forgotten what it felt like to want something you couldn't have, and I was stupid enough to make that my problem. But wanting isn't the same as deserving, and we wanted without considering what it would cost everyone else. And now Cassian's raising an army, and now he's raising an army. She moved to the window, stared out at nothing. He'll march on Nightthorn, you know that. He'll bring the Southern Legions and anyone else who believes loyalty should mean something, and he'll demand justice. What kind of justice? Elira looked back at him, and her eyes held no comfort. The kind that involves watching everything you built burn, because that's what betrayal earns, not forgiveness. Fire. Vaelor moved beside her at the window, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. If I could undo it. You can't. That's the whole point. We made choices, and choices have trajectories. You can't call them back. You can only stand in the path of what's coming and hope you're strong enough to survive it. Are you? Am I what? Strong enough to survive what's coming. Elira turned to face him fully, and her expression carried the kind of exhausted honesty that only emerged when all pretense had been burned away. I don't know. I wake up every morning and remember what we did, and it feels like drowning. But I also remember why we did it, and I can't make myself regret the feeling even though I regret everything else. Does that make me terrible? It makes you human. She laughed without humor. That's what you keep saying, like being human excuses anything. But maybe humans are just animals who learn to build empires, and we're still governed by the same base instincts: wanting, taking, destroying what we can't have. You don't believe that.
I don't know what I believe anymore.
Elira's voice went quieter. I used to think I understood the difference between right and wrong. That marriage vows meant something absolute. That loyalty was a line you didn't cross. And then I crossed it anyway. And now I'm standing in a palace waiting for war to come because I couldn't control myself around a man who wears a crown like it's a prison. Is that how you see me? A prisoner? I see you as someone who confused dominance with connection, who spent so long controlling everything that when you finally felt something real, you couldn't tell the difference between intimacy and obsession. The words landed like accusations, and Vaelor felt anger rise hot in his chest. So this was obsession? All of it? Elira's eyes softened slightly. Some of it was real. That's what makes it worse. If it was just desire, just physical need, we could have controlled it. But you made yourself vulnerable, and I responded to that vulnerability. And somewhere in there, we both forgot that other people's hearts were involved. I didn't forget Cassian. Yes, you did. You absolutely did. Because if you'd truly considered what this would do to him, you would have stopped. But you didn't, because in that moment, your need to feel human mattered more than his need to trust his wife and his king. The silence that followed was heavy enough to collapse under. Finally, Vaelor spoke, his voice rougher. What do you want from me? Apology? Regret? What would possibly be enough? I want you to understand that some things can't be fixed, that no amount of wishing it different will change the fact that we broke something that mattered, and now we have to live with it, even if living with it means watching it destroy everything around us. She moved toward the door, but Vaelor caught her wrist, gentle but insistent. Don't leave. It wasn't a command. It was a plea. And the vulnerability in it broke something in Elira's careful defenses. She turned back, and when she looked at him, her eyes were bright with tears she wouldn't let fall. This is the problem. You keep asking me to stay, and part of me wants to, and that wanting is going to kill us both. Then let it kill us. At least we'll feel it. Elira pulled free, and her voice carried the weight of someone making a decision that would haunt her either way. You're not a romantic, Vaelor. You're just a man who finally discovered he has a heart, and you don't know what to do with it except demand it gets what it wants. That's not love. That's just tyranny wearing a different mask. She left, and Vaelor stood alone in the gallery, surrounded by frozen beauty and the growing certainty that some victories leave you more defeated than if you'd lost. Queen Cerys convened the Northern Lords 3 days later, and she didn't invite the king. That's how far things had deteriorated, his own queen assembling a war council without his presence, and no one questioning whether she had the authority. The meeting happened in the Old Solar, a chamber reserved for matters too sensitive for the throne room's formal pageantry. 15 lords attended, representing the territories that had remained loyal, not from devotion, but from geographic necessity. These were practical men who understood power as a transaction, not a mythology. Cerys presided with the calm efficiency of someone who'd spent years preparing for exactly this moment. Gentlemen, she began, her voice carrying despite its softness, we're here because the Empire is fracturing, and pretending otherwise serves no one. Lord Cassian Vaelor has withdrawn the southern legions. Intelligence suggests he'll march within the month. The question before us isn't whether we can avoid conflict, it's whether we survive it. Lord Garin of the Northern Marches, a scarred veteran who'd held his territory through 3 separate rebellions, leaned forward. With respect, Your Majesty, this is the king's fight. He broke faith with his most loyal commander. Let him face the consequences. This is the Empire's fight, Cerys corrected sharply. When civil war erupts, it doesn't confine itself to the guilty. It consumes everything, your lands, your people, your trade routes. All of it burns regardless of whose bed started the fire. Lord Voren, younger and more ambitious, spoke up. Then perhaps the solution is removing the source of instability. The king made this mess. Maybe the Empire needs different leadership. The room went quiet. Suggesting regicide, even obliquely, was the kind of statement that got men executed or crowned depending on how the power dynamics shifted. Cerys studied Voren with cold assessment. Are you volunteering to wear the crown, Lord Voren? Because I assure you, deposing a king who still controls the capital and the northern garrisons would require resources you don't possess and risks you haven't calculated.
I'm suggesting, Vorin replied carefully, that loyalty has limits. And when a king destroys the foundation of that loyalty, perhaps we owe him nothing. You owe the Empire everything, Sarah said flatly. Your titles, your lands, your authority, all of it exists because Nightthorn remains stable. The moment we descend into succession wars and territorial disputes, you'll discover exactly how little your individual power means.
Then what do you propose? Lord Garen asked. We can't fight Cassian. His legions are the best trained forces in the Empire. And half our commanders sympathize with him because they understand what the king did. We negotiate, Sarah said. Not with Cassian, he's past reasoning, but with the Eastern lords who haven't committed yet. We offer concessions, territory, trade advantages, marriage alliances, whatever it takes to keep them from joining the Southern Rebellion. And if that fails,
then we prepare for siege warfare and hope the capital's walls are strong enough to survive what's coming. She paused, letting the weight of that settle. Understand what I'm telling you. This isn't a political squabble. This is existential. If Cassian takes Nightthorn, if he unseats the king, the precedent alone will fracture the Empire into a dozen warring territories. We'll spend the next decade bleeding ourselves into irrelevance. Lord Garen nodded slowly. Then we hold, whatever it costs.
Whatever it costs, Saris agreed, but understand the price. This isn't glorious defense of the realm. This is damage control. We're not fighting for the king's honor. We're fighting to keep the Empire from collapsing completely. The lords exchanged glances, each calculating their own odds of survival, each deciding how much loyalty was worth when measured against personal preservation. Finally, they agreed, not because they believed in Vaelor, because they feared the alternative more. When the meeting concluded and the lords dispersed, Saris remained alone in the solar, staring at maps marked with territories that might hold or might fracture, wondering at what point political survival stopped being different from simple cowardice. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Vaelor entered without waiting for permission, and the fact that he knocked at all showed exactly how much had changed. You assembled the lords without me, he said. Not quite accusation, not quite observation. You would have made it worse. Saris didn't look up from the maps. They needed to see strength, not guilt. They needed to believe we can survive this. And can we? Maybe. If we're smart and lucky and willing to sacrifice everything that isn't absolutely essential. She finally met his gaze. That includes your pride, your heart, and whatever you think you have with Lady Elira. I'm not sending her away.
Then you're a fool.
Saris's voice stayed level, but underneath lived decades of careful patience finally exhausted. You've spent 17 years being a king, and now you're throwing it away because you finally felt something. That's not tragic, that's just pathetic. You think I don't know what this cost? I think you know intellectually, but don't feel it properly. Because if you truly understood what you'd done, you'd be making different choices. She moved away from the maps, faced him directly. Cassian gave you 15 years of absolute loyalty. He defended your borders, crushed your enemies, asked for nothing except respect and the right to build a life. And you repaid that by taking the one thing that mattered to him. I didn't take her. She chose... Don't. Saris's voice went sharp as broken glass. Don't pretend this was mutual discovery. You're a king. She was the wife of your subordinate. The power dynamic alone makes choice complicated. But beyond that, you pursued this. You created opportunities. You made yourself vulnerable in ways that manipulated her empathy. This wasn't romance. It was predation dressed in honest feelings. That's not fair. Fair? You want to discuss fair? Saris laughed, and the sound held no warmth. I've spent 15 years being your political partner while you treated our marriage like a business arrangement. I've held this empire together while you played at being untouchable, and I never once complained because I understood the bargain. But then you meet someone who challenges you, who sees you as human, and suddenly all those years of discipline mean nothing. You're saying you're jealous. I'm saying I'm tired. Tired of watching you destroy what we built because you finally discovered you have feelings. Tired of managing your mistakes. Tired of being the competent queen beside a king who's decided being a person matters more than being a ruler. Then leave. Divorce me. Expose the whole mess and let the empire fracture completely.
Sarah studied him for a long moment, and her expression shifted to something approaching sadness. You still don't understand. I can't leave, because unlike you, I actually care about what happens to these territories, these people, this fragile construction we've spent years maintaining. So I'll stay. I'll hold things together while you indulge your newfound humanity. And when this is over, when Cassian has been defeated or you've been deposed, I'll still be here trying to salvage what remains. Why? Because someone has to care about more than their own heart. She left him standing in the solar, surrounded by maps and strategies, and the growing realization that he'd broken more than just Cassian's trust. He'd broken the last thread of partnership with the only person who'd actually understood what the crown demanded. The first snow of real winter arrived 3 weeks after Cassian's withdrawal, and with it came reports that changed everything. The southern legions were moving, not north toward Nightthorn directly, but positioning themselves in ways that cut off supply routes and isolated the capital from its agricultural territories. Cassian wasn't charging in for dramatic confrontation. He was implementing siege tactics, planning to starve the Empire's heart until it had no choice but to negotiate or collapse. It was brilliant. It was cruel. It was exactly what Vaelor would have done. Lord Marshal Theron delivered the intelligence in the war room, surrounded by commanders whose expressions ranged from grim to terrified. He's not giving us a battle, Theron said, pointing to the map where markers showed troop movements. He's giving us a choice. Surrender what he wants or watch the capital slowly die. What does he want? One of the younger commanders asked. Theron looked at Vaelor. Justice, which in practical terms means the king's head and Lady Elira's return. The room went silent. Finally, Lord Garin spoke, his voice careful. That's not negotiable. We don't hand over the crown just because I betrayed the man who defended it? Vaelor interrupted. Say what you mean, Garin. Because I'm the reason we're in this position? With respect, Your Majesty, yes. Vaelor stood, moved to the map, studied the positions with the kind of detached analysis that had won him campaigns before personal feelings complicated strategy. He's positioned brilliantly. We can hold the capital for maybe 3 months if we ration carefully. But after that, starvation becomes rebellion, and rebellion becomes overthrow. So we need to break the siege, another commander suggested. With what forces? Theron countered. Half our best legions are with Cassian. The northern garrisons are adequate for defense, but not offensive operations, and the eastern lords are still deciding which side to commit to. Then we make them commit, Vaelor said. Send envoys, promise them anything. Territory, gold, marriages to royal bloodlines. Whatever it takes to tip the balance. And if they refuse, then we discover whether the capital's walls are as strong as we've always claimed. Plans were made, strategies formed, commanders assigned to defensive positions, but underneath the tactical discussion, everyone in the room understood the real truth. They were preparing not for victory, but for survival. And survival, when measured against everything they'd built, felt like defeat wearing a different name. Elira found Vaelor on the eastern battlements 2 nights later, standing where wind cut through stone and turned breath to fog. Snow swirled around them, and the city below glittered with lights that seemed too fragile to last. She didn't speak immediately, just stood beside him, both of them staring at an empire holding its breath. Finally, Vaelor broke the silence. He's going to win. Probably. I could stop it, give him what he wants. Which is what? Your head? Me? Both? Justice, Vaelor said, whatever that means to a man whose entire world got destroyed by the 2 people he trusted most. Elira pulled her cloak tighter against the cold. Justice is a story we tell ourselves when we want revenge to sound noble. Cassian doesn't want justice. He wants to hurt you the way you hurt him. And unfortunately, the only way to do that is through fire and siege and watching everything you built collapse. You sound like you understand him. I do. She turned to face Vaelor directly. Because I'd want the same thing if our positions were reversed. If you'd taken something precious from me and smiled while doing it, I'd burn your empire down just to see if you cared more about power or about what you destroyed to keep it. I care. Do you? Or do you care about losing? The question hit harder than the wind. Vaelor's jaw tightened. What's the difference? The difference is whether you'd feel guilty if you won.
Whether this regret you're carrying would exist if Cassian had accepted it quietly, and we could have continued meeting in sanctuaries beneath the palace. I think you're sorry you got caught. I'm not sure you're sorry you did it. That's not true, isn't it? Because here we are, facing the consequences, and you're still asking me to stay. You're still choosing personal feeling over political necessity. That tells me everything about whether you've actually learned anything. What do you want me to do? Send you back? Let him have you, like your property to be returned? I want you to understand that love doesn't excuse harm. That feeling something deeply doesn't make the destruction it causes more acceptable. Alira's voice cracked slightly. I love my husband. Not the way I felt recognition with you, but in a simpler, more sustainable way. He was good to me, loyal, kind, everything you're supposed to want. But you wanted me instead. I wanted both. And that impossibility is the problem. She turned back to the view of the city. Human hearts are selfish things. They want what they want without considering whether the wanting is fair or whether pursuing it will destroy everything good that already exists. So what do we do now? We wait. We watch your empire fracture. We see if Cassian's need for justice is stronger than whatever forces you can rally. And then, when this is over, we figure out how to live with what we've become. Which is what? Alira looked at him with eyes that held both tenderness and something like disgust. People who chose feeling over honor. Who broke vows because temporary connection mattered more than permanent trust. We're not villains, we're just weak. And sometimes weakness costs more than evil ever could. She left him on the battlements, and Vaelor stood alone, surrounded by falling snow and the distant lights of a city that had always feared him, but was now beginning to question whether fear was enough to hold an empire together when the man demanding it had proven he was just as fallible as anyone else. Fuck. The Eastern Lord's response arrived 1 week later. They would remain neutral, which was political language for we're waiting to see who wins before committing to either side. It was a catastrophic blow. Without Eastern support, Nightthorn stood alone against the Southern legions. The mathematical reality was brutal. 3 months until starvation forced surrender, maybe 4 if they rationed aggressively and winter slowed Cassian's movements. Vaelor called an emergency council, and for the first time in 17 years, he stood before his assembled commanders and nobles without absolute certainty. The Eastern Lords have declined support, he began, his voice steady despite the weight pressing on his chest. That means we face the Southern legions without reinforcement, siege warfare, limited supplies, and an enemy commander who knows every defensive strategy we possess because I taught them to him. One of the younger nobles, Lord Breskin, stood. Your Majesty, perhaps negotiation. Won't work, Lord Marshal Theron interrupted. Cassian isn't interested in terms. He's interested in justice, which in his calculation means watching this empire burn for betraying him. Then we surrender, another voice called out. Better to negotiate now than starve later. Surrender means giving up the crown, Vaelor said flatly. It means execution or exile. And it means validating the principle that loyalty matters more than authority. If I step down because I betrayed one man's trust, what precedent does that set? That kings answer to commanders? That personal grievances override political stability? The principle that kings aren't above consequence, Queen Cerys said quietly from her position beside the throne. Maybe that's not the worst precedent. The room fell silent. Vaelor turned to look at his wife, this woman who'd maintained perfect composure through everything, and saw calculation in her expression that went beyond simple pragmatism. You think I should surrender? I think you should consider what survival looks like. For the Empire, not just for you. The Empire doesn't survive if the crown becomes something that can be unseated by hurt feelings. No, Cerys agreed. But it also doesn't survive civil war. Sometimes the choice isn't between good options, it's between bad options and catastrophic ones. Vaelor looked at the assembled faces, commanders who'd followed him through campaigns, nobles who'd pledged fealty, soldiers who'd bled defending borders he'd secured. They were looking at him not with fear anymore, but with something more dangerous. Doubt. The Empire's foundation wasn't just military power. It was the mythology of control, the belief that the crown represented something stable and absolute. And that mythology cracked the moment people realized their king was human enough to make mistakes this large. We hold, Vaelor said finally. We fortify the capital, we ration supplies, and we hold until Cassian makes a mistake or Winter forces him to withdraw. And if he doesn't make mistakes? Lord Garen asked. He's your student, Your Majesty. You trained him too well. Then we discover what the crown is actually worth when everything else gets stripped away. The council concluded. Plans were implemented, but everyone leaving that room understood they were preparing not for victory, but for a very expensive form of failure. Cassian's forces arrived at the capital's outer territories 2 weeks later, visible on the horizon like a storm front moving in. 12,000 soldiers, perfectly positioned, cutting off every supply route without engaging in actual combat. It was siege warfare at its most efficient. And watching it unfold from the palace battlements, Vaelor felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Helplessness. Not the momentary frustration of a setback, but the deep existential recognition that events had moved beyond his control, that all his strategy and dominance and carefully maintained authority meant nothing against a man who'd decided justice mattered more than survival. Elira appeared beside him as twilight turned the horizon purple, and smoke from Cassian's camps rose like offerings to gods who'd stopped listening. He's really doing it, she said quietly. Yes, this is what we cost him. Everything he believed in. Vaelor nodded, unable to form words past the weight in his chest. They stood in silence, watching an army assemble that existed because they'd chosen feeling over honor, connection over loyalty, the temporary warmth of recognition over the permanent foundation of trust. And in that moment, watching his empire begin to fracture under the weight of his own choices, Vaelor finally understood what Cerys and Elira and even Theron had been trying to tell him. A crown could command armies. It could enforce order through fear and violence. It could hold territory and execute enemies and maintain the machinery of power. But it couldn't make someone forgive you. It couldn't undo betrayal. It couldn't force loyalty back into existence once you'd proven it was wasted on you. And standing there with Elira beside him and Cassian's army surrounding them and Winter settling over everything like a judgment, Vaelor realized he'd spent 17 years building an empire on control. And he'd destroyed it in months by finally learning to feel. The irony would have been poetic if it wasn't so absolutely catastrophic. Elira's hand found his, just for a moment, a gesture that meant everything and solved nothing. I'm sorry, she whispered. I know, that doesn't fix anything. I know that too. Below them, watchfires multiplied across the southern positions, thousands of lights marking the army that had come not for conquest but for judgment. And above them, stars emerged through breaks in the clouds, cold and distant and indifferent to the small human disasters playing out beneath them. Whatever happened next, whatever choices remained, one thing had become absolutely clear. They had crossed a boundary that couldn't be uncrossed. And now all that remained was discovering whether the fall would be quick or prolonged, merciful or brutal. The kind of ending that history remembered, or the kind that just faded into forgotten tragedy. The siege had begun. The empire was fracturing. And somewhere in the camps below, a man they'd both loved and betrayed was preparing to show them exactly what consequence looked like when wrapped in justice and delivered by someone who'd finally stopped believing in the myths that had protected them. There would be no negotiation, no mercy, no path back to anything resembling what they'd lost. Only the long, cold descent into whatever waited at the bottom of choices made in sanctuaries beneath palaces, when temporary connection had seemed more important than permanent trust. They'd wanted to feel human. Now they would discover what being human cost when you forgot that other people's humanity mattered just as much. The answer was coming, and it looked like fire. The siege lasted 18 days before the first crack appeared, and it didn't come from outside the walls. It came from within. Lord Breskin, one of the younger nobles who'd questioned surrender during that emergency council, disappeared from his chambers on the 19th morning. His servants reported he'd left before dawn with minimal guard, heading toward the southern gates. By midday, scouts confirmed what everyone had suspected, but no one wanted to voice. He'd defected to Cassian's camp. The news spread through the palace like poison in water, quiet, and inevitably fatal. Vaelor received the report in his study, surrounded by maps that showed a city slowly strangling under siege, and felt something fundamental shift in his chest. Not surprise. Not even anger. Recognition. This was how empires died. Not in dramatic battles with clear victors, but through slow erosion, one defection at a time, until the center couldn't hold and everything collapsed inward. Here's what people don't understand about betrayal until they've built something that requires absolute loyalty. The first defection isn't the worst one. It's the permission. It's the moment when everyone else who'd been considering the same move realizes they won't be the first, won't bear the full weight of judgment, can slip away in the growing crowd of people abandoning ship. Breskin wasn't the problem. Breskin was the symptom of a disease that had been spreading since the moment Vaelor chose desire over duty. Lord Marshal Theron entered without knocking, his face carrying the kind of exhaustion that came from holding together something already broken. We need to address this, now, before every noble in the palace starts calculating whether they're better off with Cassian. Vaelor didn't look up from the maps. What would you have me do? Execute the families of anyone who considers defecting. That'll inspire loyalty. I'd have you show strength. Remind people what happens when they break faith with the crown. By becoming exactly what Cassian's claiming I am, a tyrant who demands loyalty he hasn't earned. You lost the high ground the moment you touched his wife, Theron said flatly. We're past moral arguments. This is about survival now. Either you hold this city through fear, or you watch it dissolve because people think compassion is the same as weakness. And if I become that, the king who rules through terror because he can't command respect, then at least you're still the king. Vaelor finally looked at the marshal, this man who'd served faithfully through campaigns and conquests, and saw calculation replacing the loyalty that had once been automatic. Even you're already weighing whether I'm worth defending. Theron didn't flinch. Every day since this started. That's not betrayal, Your Majesty. That's pragmatism. I've got family, lands, a legacy to protect. If you're taking the Empire down with you, I need to know whether jumping ship is survival or cowardice. And which is it? Haven't decided yet. Theron moved to the map table, studied the siege positions that tightened daily. But I'll tell you what tips the balance. Leadership. Not the crown, not the authority you were born into, but actual leadership. The kind that makes men believe following you into hell is better than the alternative. You had that once, before you forgot that kings don't get personal lives. So I should sacrifice everything human about myself to maintain an empire built on fear? You should understand that you already made that sacrifice the day you took the crown. Everything after was you pretending you could have it both ways. Theron's voice carried no anger, just weary honesty. Cassian understood that better than you did. He knew service meant giving up personal desires. That's why his loyalty was absolute. And that's why betraying him hit harder than any military defeat could. The door opened without warning. Queen Cerys entered, and her expression stopped both men cold. We have a problem larger than Breskin's defection. How much larger? The Eastern Lords have sent an envoy. They're not staying neutral anymore. Vaelor felt his stomach drop. They're joining Cassian. Worse. Cerys moved to the table, placed a sealed letter among the maps. They're proposing arbitration, a formal trial where both sides present their case and the Eastern Lords act as judges. Winner takes the empire. That's not how succession works. It is when traditional authority has collapsed. Cerys met his gaze without mercy. They're offering you a chance to defend yourself publicly, to present your version of events, to let someone besides force of arms decide whether you deserve to remain king. It's a trap. Of course it's a trap. But it's also the only path that doesn't end in complete destruction. If you refuse, you're admitting guilt. If you accept, you at least have a chance to what? Explain that I betrayed my most loyal commander because I fell in love with his wife? That I destroyed the man who defended my borders because I needed to feel human? Vaelor's voice rose. There's no defense that makes this acceptable. Then you're already dead, Cerys said quietly. The question is whether you take the Empire with you. The arbitration was set for 7 days hence, to be held in the neutral territory of Greymark Hall, an ancient fortress that straddled the border between eastern and southern territories. Both parties would present evidence and testimony. The Eastern Lords would render judgment. Winner would be recognized as legitimate authority. Loser would be executed or exiled, depending on the severity of crimes proven. It was theater disguised as justice, but theater with absolutely real consequences. Vaelor had 3 days to decide whether to attend.
On the second night, Elira appeared in his chambers past midnight, and her presence carried the weight of someone who'd finally stopped running from what they'd done. "You're going," she said, not quite question, not quite command. "Do I have a choice?" Everyone always has a choice. She moved to the window where moonlight painted the besieged city in silver and shadow. "The question is whether you can live with the consequences of not going. And if I go? If I stand before those lords and admit what I did, what happens to you?" Elira turned, and her expression was harder than he'd ever seen it. "Don't make me part of your calculations. This isn't about protecting me. This is about whether you're brave enough to face judgment for your own choices. They'll demand you testify. They'll ask what happened between us. Then I'll tell the truth." She moved closer, and her voice carried a brittle kind of strength. "I'll stand in front of those men and admit I betrayed my husband because I was selfish enough to believe connection mattered more than vows. I'll let them see exactly what we are. Two people who destroyed something good because temporary feelings seem more important than permanent trust. You don't have to do that." "Yes, I do. Because anything less is cowardice disguised as protection." Elira's eyes were bright but dry. "You taught me something, Vaelor, though I doubt you meant to. You taught me that power without accountability is just tyranny with better furniture. And if we want to be more than tyrants, if we want to actually be the humans we claim to be discovering, then we face what we've done. They might execute you, not just exile. Execution." "I know. And you're still willing?" "I stopped being willing 3 weeks ago. But willing doesn't matter anymore. Only necessary matters. And this is necessary." The silence between them stretched long enough that Vaelor could hear wind moving through the palace corridors, could hear distant sounds of a city holding its breath. "I never meant for this," he said finally, the words inadequate and honest. "I know. That almost makes it worse. If you'd been deliberately cruel, if you'd set out to destroy Cassian for strategic reasons, at least there'd be clarity. But you just wanted to feel something, and that wanting was powerful enough to break everything around it. Is that what love is? Destruction disguised as connection?" Elira moved to the door, paused at the threshold. "I don't know what love is anymore. I thought I did. I thought it was Cassian's steady devotion, his uncomplicated loyalty. Then I thought it was whatever we had, that recognition, that sense of being completely seen. But maybe love isn't any single thing. Maybe it's just whatever we call the feeling that makes us act against our own self-interest. That's a depressing definition. Most honest things are." She looked back at him one last time. "When you stand before those lords, when they ask why you did this, tell them the truth. Not the strategic truth. The actual truth. That you were empty, and I made you feel full, and for a brief moment that seemed worth any price. It won't save you, but at least you'll die honest." She left, and Vaelor stood alone, surrounded by luxury and authority, and the growing certainty that everything he'd built his identity around was about to be stripped away in the most public manner possible. The convoy to Greymark Hall departed 3 days later. Vaelor rode surrounded by what remained of his loyal guard, aware that every mile took him further from the fortifications that had been his last defense. Behind him, Nightthorn stood under Cerys's command, the queen who'd spent years preparing for exactly this kind of crisis, now holding together an empire her husband had fractured. Elira rode in a separate carriage, flanked by guards who weren't quite captors but weren't quite protectors either. She'd insisted on coming despite everyone's objections, and the determination in her eyes had silenced even Theron's practical arguments. The journey took 2 days. On the morning of the third day, Greymark Hall appeared on the horizon like a judgment carved from stone in history. It was massive, ancient, built in an era when fortresses were meant to survive sieges lasting years. The Eastern Lords had chosen the location deliberately. Neutral ground, yes, but also a reminder of how temporary all power actually was. This place had outlasted a dozen kingdoms. It would outlast whatever happened next. The Great Hall had been prepared for formal proceedings. Long tables for the arbitrating lords, a raised platform for testimony, seats arranged theater-style for witnesses and observers, everything designed to turn private betrayal into public spectacle. Cassian was already there. Vaelor saw him across the hall during the initial assembly, and the shock of recognition hit harder than expected. Cassian looked older,
hollowed out, like something essential had been carved away, leaving only the architecture of who he'd been. His eyes, when they briefly met Vaelor's, carried no rage, just absence. The rage would have been easier to face. Absence meant something had died that couldn't be resurrected, and they were just performing the funeral rites. The Eastern Lords presiding were led by High Arbiter Solon, a white-haired statesman who'd maintained his territories through 3 separate dynastic transitions by being ruthlessly fair in a world that rarely rewarded fairness. His voice, when he called the proceedings to order, carried the weight of someone who understood exactly what kind of precedent was being set. We gather to adjudicate a crisis of loyalty and authority. King Vaelor Duskbane stands accused by Lord Commander Cassian Vain of betrayal most intimate, the seduction of a sworn vassal's wife, the destruction of trust that forms the foundation of military hierarchy, and the abuse of royal authority for personal satisfaction. These are not charges of law alone, but of honor, of the compact between ruler and ruled. The hall went quiet enough that breathing became audible. Lord Cassian, you will present your case first. Speak plainly and with evidence where possible. Cassian stood, and when he moved to the testimony platform, every eye in the hall tracked him. He wore simple military attire, no decoration, no symbols of rank, just a man who'd been broken and was somehow still standing. His voice, when he spoke, was steady in a way that suggested enormous effort to maintain. I served King Vaelor for 15 years, defended his borders, crushed his enemies, asked for nothing except honor and the right to build a life separate from constant war. When I married Lady Elira, I believed I'd finally found the peace that service had earned me. He paused, and the silence stretched. I was wrong, because while I was securing supply lines and managing legions, my king was pursuing my wife, meeting her in secret, creating intimacy that violated every principle of loyalty I'd spent my life upholding. And you have proof of these meetings? Arbiter Solon asked. Cassian gestured to an aide who brought forward documents. Guard logs showing late-night movements to restricted palace sections. Servant testimonies about the king and Lady Elira being alone together repeatedly. Letters from Queen Ceres detailing her suspicions. Nothing conclusive alone, but assembled together, a pattern emerged that was damning in its consistency. This isn't about jealousy, Cassian continued. This isn't even about my marriage, though that was destroyed. This is about what kind of man can demand loyalty from soldiers while betraying the loyalty of those who served him most faithfully. A king holds power not because of divine right or military force, but because people believe following him serves something larger than his personal desires. When that belief shatters, what remains? He looked directly at Vaelor then, and the devastation in his expression was more powerful than any accusation. I trusted you with my life. You repaid that by taking the only thing that mattered more. I'm not seeking the throne. I'm seeking acknowledgement that some betrayals are too fundamental to survive, and that a king who prioritizes personal desire over the compact of loyalty has forfeited the right to rule. Cassian sat down, and the weight of his testimony hung in the hall like smoke after fire. Arbiter Solon turned to Vaelor. Your Majesty, you have the right to respond, to present defense or mitigating circumstances. The floor is yours. Vaelor stood, moved to the platform, and felt the eyes of everyone in the hall assessing him, not as a king, but as a man accused of something he couldn't deny. He'd spent 3 days preparing various defenses, strategic explanations, contextual mitigations, political justifications. Standing there, facing Cassian's devastated composure and the assembled witnesses to his failure, every prepared defense tasted like ash. So he spoke the truth instead. Everything Lord Cassian has said is accurate. I did pursue his wife. I did create opportunities for intimacy. I did betray the trust of the man who defended my empire with absolute loyalty. The hall stirred. This wasn't what they'd expected. Immediate admission without qualification. I could tell you it was love. That I discovered something with Lady Elira that made me feel human for the first time in decades. That the crown had made me so empty that connection seemed worth any price. And all of that would be true. Vaelor's voice carried across the silent hall. But truth doesn't equal justification. I was lonely, yes. I felt trapped by the performance of kingship, yes. I found in Lady Elira a recognition that nothing else provided, yes. And none of that changes the fact that I took something that wasn't mine to take from a man who'd given me everything without condition. He looked at Cassian directly. You're right about all of it. I did prioritize personal desire over the compact of loyalty. I did betray you in the most intimate way possible. And I did it knowing it was wrong, because in those moments, feeling something real seemed more important than maintaining the principles I'd spent years enforcing. Where's your defense? Arbiter Solon asked. Where's the argument for why we should allow you to remain king? Vaelor felt something crack in his chest, years of careful control finally collapsing under the weight of absolute honesty. There is no defense. Not really. I could argue strategic necessity, that deposing a king during external threats sets dangerous precedent, that stability matters more than personal justice. But those are political calculations, not moral truths. Then what are you asking us to judge? Whether a man who finally learned to feel human should be destroyed for the education. Vaelor's voice went quieter. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve that. I'm asking whether acknowledging guilt and accepting consequence is enough, or whether some mistakes are too large to survive regardless of growth. The hall absorbed this, and Vaelor could feel the judgment shifting, calculations being made about precedent and principle, and what kind of empire they wanted to build from the wreckage. Then Arbiter Solon did something unexpected. Lady Elira Vane, please approach for testimony. The hall went silent. Elira stood, moved to the platform with shoulders straight and expression composed despite the weight of what was being asked. She didn't look at Vaelor or Cassian, just faced the Arbiter directly. Lady Elira, you were present during these encounters. You are complicit in what occurred. We need your account to understand the full truth of this situation. Elira's voice, when she spoke, carried the steady weight of someone who'd stopped running from what they'd done. I betrayed my husband, not through force or coercion, but through choice. The king pursued me, yes, but I responded to that pursuit. I engaged in conversations that became intimate. I attended meetings I knew were inappropriate, and eventually I crossed boundaries I'd sworn never to breach. Why? Because I was selfish. Elira's composure cracked slightly. Because my husband's devotion, as complete and loyal as it was, felt simple in ways I'd convinced myself were limiting. Because the king looked at me and saw things my husband never asked about, my thoughts on philosophy, on power, on the difference between ruling and leading. And that recognition felt intoxicating enough that I forgot what it would cost. She finally looked at Cassian, and tears were visible now. You loved me without conditions. You built a life where I was safe and valued and protected. And I repaid that by wanting something more complicated, something that felt deeper even though it was really just more selfish. Cassian's face remained stone, but his hands gripped the table edge hard enough that knuckles went white. Were you coerced in any way? Arbiter Solon asked. Did the king use his authority to pressure you? Elira shook her head. He made himself vulnerable. That's different from coercion, but maybe worse because vulnerability is harder to resist than commands. He showed me his loneliness, his sense of being trapped by the crown, his desperate need to feel seen as something other than a symbol. And I responded to that because I wanted to be the person who could see him. So this was mutual. Yes. Mutual selfishness, mutual willingness to prioritize our connection over the man we both owed loyalty to. Elira's voice broke. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I'm just trying to be honest about what we were. Two people who felt something real and decided that feeling was more important than the trust we'd been given. She stepped down, and the hall sat in stunned silence, everyone processing the raw honesty of testimony that offered no defense, no justification, just brutal acknowledgement of failure. Bastillets. The arbitration continued for 3 more hours. Additional witnesses testified. Evidence was presented. Arguments were made about precedent and political necessity and whether personal betrayal negated military accomplishment. But underneath all the formal procedure, everyone understood the real question being adjudicated. Could a king who'd proven himself human in the worst ways still be trusted to rule an empire that required something more than human? The Eastern lords withdrew to deliberate. While they conferred, Vaelor found himself standing in a side chamber, staring at tapestries depicting ancient battles, wondering which had been the last moment he could have made a different choice. When Elira first appeared in his court? When he'd called the first private meeting? When she'd kissed him in that sanctuary and he'd kissed back? Or had the path been set years earlier, when he'd accepted the crown and slowly let it hollow him out until there was nothing left inside except hunger for something real? Cassian appeared in the doorway. Not threatening. Not even angry anymore. Just present. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Cassian broke the silence. I used to think loyalty was simple, that if you served faithfully, if you gave everything, the universe rewarded that with meaning. I was wrong. I never meant to— Don't. Cassian's voice cut through Vaelor's attempted apology. Don't tell me you didn't mean to destroy me. You did destroy me. Intentionally or not doesn't change that. What I need to understand is whether you think feeling something justified the destruction. Vaelor met his former commander's eyes. No, it didn't justify anything, but it explained it in ways I couldn't have articulated before. I was dying slowly, Cassian. The crown was killing everything human about me. And when Elira looked at me and saw past the authority to something real underneath, I grabbed that lifeline without thinking about who I'd drag down with me. So I was collateral damage in your self-discovery. Yes. Vaelor forced himself not to look away. You were the cost of me remembering I was human. And that makes it worse, not better. Because at least if I'd done it from cruelty, you could hate me cleanly. But I did it from weakness, from desperate need to feel something, and that doesn't give you a clear target for your rage. Cassian's jaw worked, emotions warring across his face. I don't hate you. That's the worst part. I should hate you. I should want you dead. But I just feel empty where all that loyalty used to be. And I don't know if that emptiness is better or worse than rage. The judgment comes soon. What are you hoping for? Cassian turned toward the window, stared at nothing. I'm hoping they understand that some betrayals are too fundamental to ignore. That if you remain king after this, it sends a message that authority excuses everything. But I'm also hoping I can find a way to live with whatever comes next, because revenge doesn't actually fill the hole that betrayal leaves. If they strip the crown, then you'll discover what you are without it. And maybe that's the real judgment. Not whether you keep the throne, but whether there's anything worth saving underneath the crown once it gets removed. He left. And Vaelor stood alone, surrounded by tapestries depicting victories that suddenly seemed meaningless compared to the intimate defeat of destroying the one relationship that had mattered without complications. The Eastern Lords returned to the hall 2 hours later. Arbiter Solon's expression revealed nothing as he took his seat, but the weight in the room suggested everyone understood the magnitude of what was about to be pronounced. We have deliberated on the evidence presented, the testimony heard, and the principles at stake. This judgment concerns not just one man's behavior, but the foundation upon which legitimate authority rests. The hall held its breath. King Vaelor Duskbane, you have admitted to betraying Lord Commander Cassian Vain in the most intimate manner possible. You pursued his wife, created conditions for infidelity, and prioritized personal desire over the loyalty owed to those who serve the crown. These actions violate not just social custom, but the fundamental compact between ruler and subject. Vaelor forced himself to remain standing, to face the judgment with whatever dignity remained. However, Arbiter Solon's voice carried weight beyond the words. We must also consider that absolute honesty, acceptance of guilt, and willingness to face consequence demonstrate qualities rarely seen in rulers who've maintained power for extended periods. You did not deflect. You did not minimize. You stood before us and acknowledged the truth completely. This does not excuse your actions, but it complicates the question of remedy. The hall stirred, sensing the judgment pivoting in unexpected directions. After careful deliberation, we have concluded that King Vaelor Duskbane must abdicate the crown. The betrayal is too fundamental, the violation of trust too complete, to allow continued rule without fundamentally undermining the principle that authority requires accountability. Vaelor felt something break and settle inside him simultaneously, the terror of losing everything he'd built, and the strange relief of finally being free from the weight of it. However, Solon continued, we recognize that immediate execution or permanent exile serves no one. Therefore, our judgment is as follows. King Vaelor will formally abdicate and relinquish all claims to the throne of Nightthorn. Queen Cerys Duskbane, who has demonstrated competent leadership during this crisis, will assume regency until proper succession can be established through traditional means. He paused, letting that settle. Lord Commander Cassian Vaelor, you have proven both your loyalty and your principle. You are hereby granted the Southern Territories to govern autonomously, with the understanding that alliance with Nightthorn will be maintained through diplomatic rather than military subjugation. And Lady Elira Vaelor will be released from all legal obligation to either party, free to determine her own path forward without constraint from husband or former lover. Her honesty warrants at least the freedom to rebuild a life from the wreckage of choices made. Arbiter Solon stood, and his expression carried the weight of someone who'd just rewritten the rules governing legitimate authority. This judgment acknowledges that humans govern humans, that weakness and strength coexist in all of us, and that accountability matters more than maintaining false mythologies of infallibility. The empire doesn't survive because its rulers are perfect. It survives because they're held accountable when they fail. The hall erupted in controlled chaos, nobles calculating what this meant for their positions, commanders reassessing loyalty structures, everyone trying to understand how power had just been redistributed. Vaelor stood motionless, feeling 17 years of identity stripped away in a few sentences, and underneath the devastation, something else emerged. Not relief exactly, but the recognition that he'd been carrying weight he was never meant to carry, that the crown had demanded he become something inhuman, and that losing it might be the first step toward discovering what remained when all the false supports got removed. Cassian left the hall without looking back. Elira caught Vaelor's eye across the room, and her expression carried the same exhausted recognition. They'd survived the judgment, but surviving wasn't the same as winning. They'd simply been given the chance to figure out who they were when everything they'd used to define themselves got taken away. And standing there, surrounded by the wreckage of an empire he'd held for nearly 2 decades, Vaelor finally understood what Cerys and Theron and even Elira had been trying to teach him. The crown had protected him from consequence. Without it, he'd have to learn how to be human in ways that didn't destroy everyone around him. The question was whether that education was possible, or whether some people were too fundamentally damaged by power to ever function without it. The answer would take years to discover, and the first step was walking out of this hall, not as a king being restored, but as a man being forced to finally learn what he should have known before he ever touched the crown. That dominance isn't the same as connection, that control isn't the same as relationship, and that sometimes the only way to become someone worth being is to lose everything that let you avoid facing who you actually were. The guards moved forward, not hostile, but final. The crown was being removed, and Vaelor, for the first time in nearly 20 years, had to figure out how to exist without it. The guards escorted Vaelor from Greymark Hall, not as a prisoner, but as something worse, a former king stripped of everything that had given his existence meaning. No chains, no violence, just the quiet efficiency of power changing hands, authority dissolving like morning frost under sun that offered no warmth. The carriage ride back toward Nightthorn felt longer than the journey out, every mile a meditation on loss. Vaelor sat alone, staring at landscape that had once belonged to him and now belonged to no one, or everyone, or whoever could hold it through competence rather than birthright. Here's what nobody tells you about losing power until it's gone. The absence isn't just external. It's not just the crown, the authority, the ability to command armies. It's internal. It's waking up and realizing the person you've been for decades was a construction built around something that no longer exists, and underneath that construction is just a man who never learned how to be anything except the role. The third night of travel, scouts intercepted the carriage with reports that changed everything. Nightthorn was under attack. Not from Cassian's forces. Those had withdrawn after the arbitration, honor satisfied through judgment rather than bloodshed. From the north, Lord Vorin, the ambitious noble who'd suggested deposing Vaelor during that emergency council, had apparently decided the power vacuum created by abdication was an opportunity rather than a crisis. He'd rallied disaffected northern lords, claimed the arbitration was illegitimate eastern interference, and marched on the capital with forces that shouldn't have been able to mobilize that quickly. But desperation makes men efficient, and the scent of a collapsing empire draws predators like blood draws sharks. Vaelor listened to the scout's report with a strange detachment, processing information that should have devastated him but instead felt almost inevitable. Of course, someone was moving to seize power. Of course, the judgment hadn't actually resolved anything except who held legal authority. Of course, the Empire was fracturing exactly the way Sarius and Theron had warned it would. "How many forces does Vorin command?" Vaelor asked, his voice steady despite the exhaustion pressing on his chest. 6,000. Maybe 7. Enough to challenge the capital garrison, especially with the southern legions withdrawn and half the military structure in chaos after your abdication. And Queen Sarius? Holding the walls. For now. But she's requested you return immediately. The scout's expression suggested he didn't understand why a deposed king would be summoned to defend a city he no longer ruled, but Vaelor understood perfectly. Sarius was pragmatic to her core. She didn't want him as king, but she wanted his strategic mind, his knowledge of defensive warfare, his ability to turn desperate situations into survivable ones. She was offering him a chance to matter one more time, even without the crown. The question was whether a man who'd just lost everything had anything left to give. Nightthorn appeared on the horizon 3 days later, and even from a distance, Vaelor could see the northern forces positioned for siege. Smoke rose from the outer districts where preliminary skirmishes had already turned streets into battlegrounds. The palace stood defiant behind walls that had never been breached, but walls alone didn't win wars when the forces defending them were outnumbered and demoralized. The city gates opened just long enough for Vaelor's carriage to slip through, then slammed shut with the finality of a tomb ceiling. Inside, the streets carried the tension of a population preparing for the worst. Civilians evacuating toward central districts, soldiers fortifying positions, merchants boarding up shops that might not exist come morning. Vaelor was escorted directly to the war room where Sarius stood surrounded by maps and commanders whose expressions ranged from desperate to defeated. She looked up when he entered, and something shifted in her face that might have been relief or might have been resignation. "You came. You summoned." Vaelor moved to the map table, studied the troop positions with eyes that had memorized terrain and strategy long before the crown had complicated everything. Vorin's positioned well, cutting supply routes, preparing for prolonged siege. He's learned from watching Cassian's approach. "We can hold maybe 2 weeks," Lord Marshal Theron said from across the table. "After that, starvation forces negotiation or surrender. Negotiation with Vorin means execution for anyone who supported the arbitration's judgment," Sarius said flatly. "He's not interested in legitimate succession. He wants the crown for himself, and he'll kill anyone who might challenge that claim. Then we don't negotiate." Vaelor's finger traced the northern positions, looking for weaknesses, finding patterns. "We break the siege before he can consolidate power. With what forces? We're down to 4,000 defenders, half of them barely trained city guard. Vorin has professional soldiers who've been planning this for weeks. Then we don't fight him the way he expects." Vaelor looked up, and for the first time since the abdication, something like fire returned to his eyes. Vorin thinks he's facing a defensive garrison, protecting a queen who's never commanded military operations. He's not prepared for offense. "You're not king anymore," one of the younger commanders said carefully. "You don't command here." "No," Vaelor agreed, "but I know how to win wars that look unwinnable. And unless you've got better options, I suggest you listen anyway." Sarius studied him for a long moment, calculating odds and risks and whether trusting a deposed king was wisdom or desperation. Finally, she nodded. "Speak." Vaelor pulled the map closer, began marking positions with the kind of tactical precision that had once conquered territories. Vorin's positioned for siege, which means his forces are spread thin, maintaining encirclement. His supply lines run through the western approach because that's the flattest terrain for wagon trains. "We hit those supplies tonight. Fast strike, maximum damage, retreat before he can respond. That's suicide with our numbers. That's survival. Because once his supplies are burning, he has to either withdraw to resupply or commit to assault before he's ready. Either way, he loses the advantage of patient siege. And if he chooses assault, then we defend walls that have never fallen, with soldiers who understand this is the last stand." Vaelor's voice carried the weight of someone who'd led men through worse. Fear makes soldiers cautious, but having nothing left to lose makes them dangerous. The room absorbed this, commanders exchanging glances that suggested they were weighing whether following a deposed king was military strategy or shared madness. Theron broke the silence. "It could work. If we're fast enough. If we hit hard enough. if we're willing to risk everything on one move. We're already risking everything, Sarah said quietly. The question is whether we do it defending or attacking. She looked at Vaelor directly. This isn't you reclaiming the crown. This is you helping save what remains of the empire you nearly destroyed. Understand the difference. I understand. Vaelor met her gaze without flinching. I'm not asking for redemption. I'm offering the only skill I have left that's worth anything. Saris nodded slowly. Then prepare your strike. You have until sunset. The raid force assembled in the palace armory as twilight turned the sky purple and gold. 50 soldiers, handpicked for speed and brutality rather than formal discipline. These were men who'd survived multiple campaigns, who understood that sometimes winning meant forgetting every rule except survive and complete the mission. Vaelor moved among them, checking weapons and armor with hands that remembered this ritual from years of pre-battle preparation. He wore no crown, no royal insignia, just functional leather and steel that marked him as soldier rather than sovereign. Elira appeared in the armory doorway, and the sight of her stopped Vaelor mid-motion. She wore traveling clothes, practical and dark, and her expression carried a determination that suggested she'd already made a decision no one else would approve of. No, Vaelor said before she could speak. Absolutely not. I wasn't asking permission. Elira moved into the armory, past guards who looked uncertain whether to stop her. I'm coming with the raid. You're not trained for this. You'll get yourself killed and probably take half the force with you. I've studied warfare theory my entire life. I understand supply chain logistics better than half these soldiers. And more importantly, I'm not asking to fight. I'm asking to help identify which supplies are worth destroying and which are decoys. Vaelor grabbed her arm, not roughly but insistent. This isn't philosophy. This is blood and chaos and men dying badly. You don't need to see that. I need to stop being protected from consequences. Elira pulled free, and her eyes held no compromise. I helped break this empire. The least I can do is help keep it from collapsing completely. Don't deny me that. If you die out there, then I die doing something that matters, instead of sitting in safety pretending I'm not partially responsible for all this. The certainty in her voice made arguing pointless. Vaelor looked at Theron, who'd been watching this exchange with weary pragmatism. Can we use her? Theron shrugged. Supply analysis could save minutes we don't have. And if she's serious about taking responsibility, better she does it usefully than stupidly. Vaelor wanted to refuse, wanted to lock her somewhere safe and deal with the guilt of that choice later. But she was right. Protection was just another form of control, and he'd already learned what trying to control her cost. Stay close to me, he said finally. Do exactly what I tell you when I tell you, and if something goes wrong, you run. Understand? Elira nodded, and something passed between them that wasn't romance or even forgiveness, just the grim acknowledgement of two people who destroyed things together and were now trying to build something from the wreckage. The raid force moved out through the eastern tunnels, ancient passages built for exactly this kind of emergency egress. 52 fighters total, moving in silence, broken only by the sound of leather and steel against stone. Above them, Nightthorn held its breath. Behind them, walls that might not hold another week if this failed. Ahead, an enemy camp that had no idea defense was about to become offense. The Western Supply Depot sat 3 miles from the main siege positions, guarded by maybe 40 soldiers who'd drawn the dull assignment of watching wagons instead of preparing for glorious battle. Torches illuminated stacked crates and barrels arranged with the careful organization of a quartermaster who'd never considered they might become targets. Vaelor's force approached from the north, using terrain and darkness to get within 200 yards before anyone noticed movement. Then they charged. Not with war cries or dramatic announcement, just sudden explosive violence that turned a quiet camp into chaos in seconds. Soldiers guarding supplies weren't prepared for trained killers appearing from nowhere, weren't positioned for actual combat, couldn't coordinate defense before half of them were already dead or dying. Vaelor fought with the efficiency of someone who'd spent years turning violence into art form. His blade found throats and hearts with precision that required no thought, muscle memory from campaigns that felt like they'd belonged to someone else. Around him, the raid force moved like a single organism, overwhelming defenders through speed and brutality. Elira stayed close, her face pale but determined as she moved toward the supply crates
with eyes scanning for tactical significance. She pointed to specific wagons, called out which contained food versus weapons versus medical supplies, prioritizing targets with the same analytical clarity she'd once brought to philosophical debates. Burn those, she directed, pointing to grain stores that would cripple Voron's ability to feed his army. Leave those, indicating weapons that were decoys or already damaged. The raid force worked fast, setting fires that caught and spread with terrifying efficiency. Within minutes, the depot was an inferno, flames climbing into night sky like a beacon, announcing that the besieged weren't as helpless as they'd appeared. Movement on the southern approach, reinforcements responding to the chaos. "We're done here!" Theron shouted. "Move out!" The raid force began withdrawing, but not fast enough. Voron's reinforcements hit their flank before they'd cleared the depot perimeter, and suddenly, retreat became combat, became desperate survival. Vaelor found himself fighting 3 soldiers simultaneously, blade work that was more defensive desperation than offensive precision. One got past his guard, blade opening a line across his ribs that burned hot and immediate. He killed the man but felt blood soaking into his tunic, felt the wound pulling with each movement. Behind him, Elira screamed. He spun to see her cornered by 2 soldiers who'd identified her as non-combatant, and therefore easy target. She had a knife, was trying to defend herself with theory rather than practice, was about to die because he'd let her come on this raid. Vaelor crossed the distance in seconds that felt like hours, his blade taking the first soldier in the back before the man knew he was there. The second turned, fast enough to be dangerous, and their swords met with the ring of steel that promised one of them wasn't leaving this fight. The soldier was younger, stronger, uninjured, should have had the advantage. But Vaelor fought with the kind of desperate precision that emerged when you had nothing left to lose except the one person whose survival mattered more than your own. His blade found the gap between armor plates, found the soft tissue underneath, found the kill with efficiency born from years of turning men into corpses. The soldier dropped. Vaelor grabbed Elira's wrist, pulled her toward the withdrawal route where the raid force was disappearing into darkness. Behind them, flames climbed higher, the depot fully engulfed. Mission accomplished even if the cost was still being calculated. They ran. Through terrain that wanted to kill them, past enemy patrols responding to the chaos, across miles that felt like marathons while blood loss made Vaelor's vision narrow and pulse pound in his skull loud enough to drown thought. The eastern tunnels appeared ahead like salvation carved from stone. The raid force poured into darkness, disappearing into passages that led back to the city's heart. Vaelor stumbled in last, Elira supporting him because somewhere in the run his legs had stopped cooperating fully and the wound in his ribs had started dictating terms his will couldn't override. The tunnel doors slammed shut behind them, and in the sudden darkness broken only by torches, Vaelor let himself slide down the wall and finally acknowledged that he was bleeding badly enough that survival was becoming theoretical. Elira knelt beside him, her hands pressing against the wound with pressure that hurt more than the initial cut. "Stay with me. Don't you dare die after making me complicit in your redemption arc." Her voice was shaking, but her hands were steady, and Vaelor found himself smiling despite the pain because even now, even here, she challenged him. Around them, the raid force was cataloging casualties. 8 dead, 12 injured, but the mission successful. The supply depot was gone, Voron's siege timeline disrupted, and the defenders had proven they weren't just waiting passively for defeat. Medics appeared, began working on Vaelor with efficiency that suggested they'd seen worse. The wound was deep but clean, painful but survivable if infection didn't set in. They stitched and bandaged while he gritted teeth and refused to pass out because passing out meant vulnerability, and vulnerability had caused enough damage already. Saris arrived in the tunnel looking like she'd aged a decade in the hours since the raid departed. Her eyes found Vaelor, assessed the wound and his condition, then shifted to the reports being delivered by raid survivors. "Voron's supply lines are crippled," Theron reported. "He'll have to either assault now or withdraw to resupply. Either way, we've bought time." "How much time?" "Days, maybe a week. Not enough to end this, but enough to change the dynamic." Saris nodded, then looked back at Vaelor. "You were supposed to advise, not lead the charge yourself. Plans change in contact with the enemy." Vaelor's voice was rough but stable. "You know that. I know you're still trying to die meaningfully instead of living with what you've done." Her expression softened slightly.
Stop trying to redeem yourself through sacrifice. It's exhausting to watch. She turned to address the assembled soldiers and commanders. Tomorrow Vorin will either assault or retreat. If he assaults, we hold these walls with everything we have. If he retreats, we've survived. Either way, tonight we prove that abdication doesn't equal defeat. The Empire survives not because of crowns, but because of people willing to fight for something larger than themselves. Her gaze landed on Vaelor one more time. Even deposed kings, apparently, dominate. Vorin assaulted at dawn. The decision made sense. His supplies were crippled, his forces demoralized by the raid, and waiting would only make things worse. So he committed everything to a single massive push against the walls, betting that overwhelming force could break what patience couldn't. The battle was chaos given form and purpose. Siege ladders against stone walls. Arrows darkening the sky, soldiers screaming war cries and dying prayers in equal measure. Oil boiling in cauldrons and poured down on attackers whose screams would haunt defenders' dreams for years. Vaelor commanded from the eastern wall, not officially, but through the kind of natural authority that emerged when everyone understood he was the only one who'd fought battles this desperate before and survived. His wound pulled with every movement, but pain was just information now, data to be processed and ignored in service of staying alive long enough to keep others alive. Beside him, Elira had refused to stay in safety, had instead taken position with the medical corps treating wounded as they fell back from the walls. Her hands, which had once held philosophical texts and later had held him in forbidden sanctuaries, now held bandages and applied pressure to wounds that would kill if not treated fast enough. The first wave broke against the walls like water against stone. The second wave brought ladders and determination and started making progress. By the third wave, attackers were reaching the battlements, and fighting shifted from range to intimate. Sword work in close quarters where mistakes got you killed and hesitation got your brother killed, and the only thing that mattered was surviving the next 5 seconds. Vaelor's blade found throats and eyes and all the soft places where steel killed efficiently. Around him, defenders held because they had no choice, because retreat meant letting the city fall, because sometimes survival requires forgetting everything except the immediate fight in front of you. Hours collapsed into moments, collapsed into eternity, compressed into the space between heartbeats. And then, when exhaustion had started making mistakes inevitable, and the walls seemed ready to finally fall, horns sounded from the south. Not Vorin's forces. Different signals. Different rhythms. Cassian's southern legions appeared on the horizon like a storm front rolling in. 12,000 soldiers who'd withdrawn after the arbitration, but apparently hadn't gone far, who'd been watching to see what kind of empire emerged from the wreckage, who'd decided that whatever grievances existed between former kings and betrayed commanders mattered less than preventing opportunistic predators from tearing apart what remained. Vorin's forces, already exhausted from the assault, suddenly found themselves caught between walls they couldn't breach and professional soldiers hitting their rear. The battle lasted another hour, but the outcome was decided the moment Cassian's forces engaged. Vorin's army shattered. Some surrendered. Some fled. Some died fighting because pride wouldn't let them do anything else. By sunset, it was over. Vaelor stood on the battlements watching Cassian's forces secure the field, establishing order from chaos with the kind of efficiency that came from years of professional military discipline. His body ached in ways that suggested tomorrow would be worse than today, and his wound had reopened during the fighting, blood soaking through bandages that medics would need to replace soon. But he was alive. The city was intact, and the Empire somehow had survived another crisis. Cassian himself rode through the gates near dusk, dismounting with the careful movements of someone who'd fought hard and was feeling every year of it. He looked up at the walls, found Vaelor, and something passed between them that was too complicated for words. Not forgiveness, that was still too large to cross, but recognition, maybe. Acknowledgement that despite everything broken between them, some foundations mattered more than personal grievance. Cassian climbed to the battlements, stood beside Vaelor without speaking for a long moment. Around them, survivors were beginning the grim work of counting casualties and removing bodies and discovering who'd made it through and who hadn't. "You came back," Vaelor said finally. "I came for the Empire, not for you." Cassian's voice was steady but not cold. "What you did still stands. The betrayal is still real. But watching Vorin try to seize power through opportunistic violence reminded me that some things are worse than personal grievance. Thank you. Don't thank me. This doesn't fix anything between us. Cassian turned to face him directly. You destroyed something I thought was permanent. That doesn't heal just because I showed up to prevent worse destruction. I know. The silence stretched. Finally, Cassian spoke again, quieter. The arbitration stripped your crown but left you alive. That was mercy more than you deserved. What you do with it, whether you become someone worth that mercy or just a deposed king waiting to die, that's on you now. He descended from the battlements without waiting for response, leaving Vaelor alone with the view of a city that had survived despite him, rather than because of him. Elira appeared moments later, exhausted and blood-stained from hours in the medical corps. She stood beside him, both of them too tired for words, both of them understanding that survival didn't equal resolution. What happens now? She asked eventually. We rebuild, Vaelor said. Not what was. That's gone. But something new from the wreckage. You think that's possible? Starting over after breaking everything? I think it's the only option that isn't giving up. He looked at her, this woman who'd helped destroy him and might somehow help remake him. We don't get redemption, but maybe we get the chance to become people who deserve to keep trying. Below them, Nightthorn began the slow work of recovery. Above them, stars emerged through smoke-stained sky, and between them, the shared weight of knowing that some bridges burned beyond repair, but the land on either side still needed people brave enough to build something new, even without connection to what they'd lost. The Empire had survived. Whether they would survive as people worth saving remained the question that Dawn would begin answering. But for tonight, survival was enough. Tomorrow could bring its own judgment. Dawn arrived cold and merciless over Nightthorn, painting the battlefield in shades of gray that matched the exhaustion settling into bones and souls alike. Bodies were being counted, sorted into categories that reduced human complexity to simple administrative tasks: ally, enemy, salvageable, lost. The walls still stood, scarred but unbroken, a testament to survival that felt less like victory and more like postponed reckoning. Vaelor hadn't slept. His wound had been treated properly now, stitched and bandaged by medics who worked with the grim efficiency of people who'd seen too much death to waste sentiment on the living. The pain had settled into a constant throb that he welcomed, a reminder that consequence had physical weight, that choices made in sanctuaries beneath palaces eventually manifested as steel-opening flesh on battlements. He stood in what had been his private chambers, except they weren't his anymore. The crown was gone. The authority dissolved. What remained was just a man in a room that had once meant something, surrounded by possessions that belonged to a version of himself he barely recognized. Queen Cerys entered without knocking, because protocol had become irrelevant somewhere between abdication and desperate battle. She looked as exhausted as he felt, her composed mask cracked enough to reveal the human underneath, tired, uncertain, carrying weight that crowns distributed but never actually lightened. The council wants to formalize succession, she said, moving to the window that overlooked the recovering city. They're proposing I take permanent rule as Queen Regent until proper dynastic arrangements can be established. You'd be good at it, better than I was. That's not saying much. Cerys's voice carried no cruelty, just honest assessment. You were competent when you remembered the Empire existed outside your personal drama. But competence isn't the same as care, and somewhere in your reign you stopped caring about anything except maintaining control. Here's something people learn too late about leadership, usually only after they've lost it. Control and care are enemies masquerading as allies. You can dominate through fear and call it strength. You can demand obedience and call it loyalty. You can hold everything so tightly that nothing escapes your grasp and call it security. But none of that is the same as actually caring whether the people you're controlling have lives worth living beyond their service to your authority. Vaelor had spent 17 years confusing the two, and the Empire had nearly collapsed because he'd finally learned the difference at exactly the wrong moment. What will you do? Cerys asked, and the question carried genuine curiosity rather than judgment. You're not king anymore. You're not even really nobility at this point. The arbitration stripped most of that when they removed the crown. You're just a man who knows how to fight and strategize and apparently bleed for cities that don't belong to you anymore. I don't know. The admission felt both terrifying and liberating. For the first time in decades, I don't have a role that tells me who I'm supposed to be.
Most people call that freedom.
Most people didn't build their entire identity around a crown that defined them from childhood. Vaelor turned from the window to face his former wife directly. I'm 43 years old, and I don't know how to be anything except what I was. That's not freedom. That's just being lost with no map back to anything familiar.
Then maybe you start by learning how to be lost without trying to conquer it.
Cerys moved toward the door, paused at the threshold. The Empire survived despite you, Vaelor. Take that as either condemnation or opportunity. Your choice which. She left, and Vaelor stood alone in chambers that would soon belong to someone else, understanding that exile wasn't always geographic. Sometimes it was just waking up and realizing you'd become a stranger in your own life, and the only path forward required abandoning everything you'd used to define yourself. The formal succession ceremony happened 3 days later in the Great Hall, attended by what remained of the noble houses and military commanders who'd survived Voron's assault. Queen Cerys Duskbane was officially recognized as sovereign ruler of Nightthorn and its territories. Her authority derived not from marriage to a king, but from competent leadership during crisis. Vaelor attended from the back of the hall, no special seating, no acknowledgement beyond what any citizen might receive. He watched the crown. His crown, except it had never really been his, just borrowed and badly maintained, placed on Cerys' head by Arbiter Solon, who'd traveled from the Eastern Territories to witness this final dissolution of the old order. The ceremony was efficient, stripped of unnecessary pageantry. Oaths were sworn, positions confirmed. The machinery of power realigned itself around a new center, with the kind of pragmatic speed that demonstrated how replaceable individual rulers actually were. When it concluded, when the assembled lords and commanders began filing out to celebrate or mourn or simply process what had changed, Cassian appeared beside Vaelor without warning. They stood in silence for a long moment. Two men who'd fought together, been destroyed together, and somehow survived together despite everything broken between them. "I'm leaving tomorrow," Cassian said finally, his voice carrying the flat effect of someone who'd moved past anger into something colder and more permanent. "Taking the Southern Legions back to our territories. The alliance with Nightthorn will hold because political necessity demands it, but I won't be returning to this city."
I understand. Do you?
Cassian turned to look at him directly, and his eyes held no forgiveness but also no hatred, just exhausted honesty.
I don't think you do. I don't think you understand what you took from me. Not just Elira, though that would have been enough. You took my faith, my belief that loyalty meant something, my certainty that serving honorably would be honored in return.
You're right. I don't understand that completely. Vaelor forced himself to maintain eye contact despite the weight of Cassian's gaze. I never had faith the way you did. I had control. And when that control started slipping, when I felt human for the first time in years, I grabbed onto it without considering what I was destroying to hold it. That's not an excuse. I know. It's just the truth. And the truth is, I broke something in you that can't be repaired. All I can offer is acknowledgement that the breaking was real and the fault was mine. Cassian's jaw worked, emotions warring across his face. Years from now, maybe decades, I might forgive you. Not because you deserve it, but because carrying this rage is exhausting, and at some point I'll want to put it down. But that forgiveness, if it comes, won't mean we're whole again. It won't restore what you destroyed. It'll just mean I've learned to live with the scar. That's more than I have a right to ask for.
Yes, Cassian agreed. It is.
He turned to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, you fought well on those walls. You bled for a city that wasn't yours anymore. That doesn't balance the scales, but it suggests you might be capable of learning something beyond domination. Don't waste it. He walked away, and Vaelor felt the finality of it like a door closing on a part of his life that had defined everything and now would define nothing except his lesson learned through maximum cost. Some relationships, once broken, can't be restored. All you can do is acknowledge the breaking, accept the fault, and try to become someone who wouldn't make the same mistake again. Whether that growth matters to anyone except yourself is beyond your control. The work is internal. The judgment is external. And the gap between the two is where character gets forged or fails entirely.
Elira found him that evening in the eastern gardens where winter had stripped trees bare and left everything skeletal and honest. She wore traveling clothes, practical layers that suggested departure rather than permanence. "I'm leaving," she said without preamble. "Tomorrow. The arbitration gave me freedom from obligation to either husband or lover, and I'm taking it. Where will you go?"
East. Maybe further. Somewhere I can figure out who I am when I'm not defined by the men in my life, or the roles they needed me to fill. She moved closer, but stopped short of touching, maintaining distance that felt deliberate. I loved two men and destroyed them both through different mechanisms. That's not something you just move past. That's something you have to sit with until you understand why you're capable of it. You didn't destroy me. Vaelor gestured vaguely at himself, the gardens, the palace beyond. I'm still here. You destroyed the version of yourself you'd built. That's different from physical death, but not necessarily easier. Elira's expression carried the kind of hard-won wisdom that came from watching everything burn and having to rebuild from ash. We were both so desperate to feel something real that we forgot other people's realities mattered just as much as ours. I don't regret knowing you, even with everything it cost. You should. Regret is how you know you've learned something. Her voice softened slightly. But I understand what you mean, what we had, that recognition, that sense of being completely seen, that was real. It just wasn't worth what it destroyed. And learning that difference is maybe the only education that matters. Will I see you again? I don't know. Maybe years from now when we've both become people different enough that the past doesn't define us anymore. Or maybe never, because some connections are too costly to maintain even when the feeling underneath them remains. She moved toward the garden exit, then turned back one last time. You asked me once what love was. I said, I didn't know anymore. I still don't. But I know what it isn't. It isn't possession. It isn't recognition purchased through betrayal. It isn't two people who make each other feel complete while making everyone around them fractured. Real love, the kind that sustains rather than destroys, that's something we'll both have to learn from scratch. And if we can't, learn it, then we'll at least have learned what we're not. That's worth something. She left, and Vaelor stood alone in the gardens watching twilight settle over Nightthorn like a benediction for things ended and things beginning, and the vast, unclear space between them where humans tried to figure out how to be better than their worst impulses. 10. The final confrontation came not in battle or ceremony, but in a quiet conversation 6 days after Cerys's coronation, in a small room off the palace library where afternoon light painted everything gold and peaceful. Lord Marshal Theron requested the meeting, and when Vaelor arrived, the old soldier was standing by the window looking every one of his 60 years and then some. I'm resigning my commission, Theron said without preamble. Serving through your reign, through the abdication, through Voron's assault, it's enough. I've earned the right to retire and let someone younger carry the weight. You'd be invaluable to Cerys. The Empire needs your experience. The Empire needs new blood that isn't haunted by old mistakes. Theron turned to face him. But that's not why I called you here. I wanted to tell you something before I leave, something you need to hear from someone who watched your entire reign without the complications of personal involvement. Vaelor braced himself for judgment, for one more accounting of failures catalogued and weighed. You were a terrible king, Theron began, and Vaelor almost laughed at the bluntness. You ruled through fear when you could have led through vision. You prioritized control over care. You forgot that empires are made of people, not territories. And when you finally remembered you were human, you did it in the most destructive way possible. He paused. But you were also capable of remarkable things when you stopped trying to dominate and started trying to understand. The raid on Voron's supplies, the defense of those walls, the way you bled for a city you had no claim to anymore. Those weren't the actions of a tyrant trying to reclaim power. Those were the actions of a man trying to matter without the crown to make him matter automatically. What are you saying? I'm saying you're not done. Theron moved from the window, sat heavily in a chair that creaked under his weight. You're 43. You've lost everything you thought defined you, and now you get to discover whether there's anything underneath worth building on. Most men in your position would drink themselves to death or find some other way to exit gracefully. I'm telling you not to. Why do you care? because I spent 17 years serving a king I didn't particularly like, but sometimes respected, and I'd rather that service mean something beyond just watching you collapse now that the performance is over." Theron's expression softened. "You can't be king again. You shouldn't be. But you could be something else, something useful. If you're brave enough to learn, what would that even look like? I don't know. Advisor to someone who actually cares about the territories? Military strategist for hire? Hermit in the mountains who thinks profound thoughts and bothers no one? The specifics don't matter. What matters is choosing to become something beyond your worst mistake. And if I can't? If the crown was the only thing holding me together, and without it, I'm just fragments? Then you'll discover what most people learn much earlier, that being fragments is the human condition, and wholeness is something you build piece by piece through choices made when no authority compels them." Theron stood, prepared to leave. "You destroyed a lot, Vaelor. Now figure out what you can build. That's the work. Whether anyone notices or cares is irrelevant. The work is its own justification." He left, and Vaelor sat in the afternoon light, understanding that redemption wasn't a moment. It was a direction, a choice made repeatedly to move towards something better than what you'd been, without guarantee that the movement mattered to anyone except yourself. The Empire would continue without him. Cerys would rule competently. Cassian would rebuild his life in the southern territories. Elira would discover herself in the east. And he would figure out who Vaelor was when stripped of crown and authority and all the structures that had defined him since childhood. It was terrifying. It was necessary. It was possibly the first truly free choice he'd made in decades. 3 months later, Vaelor left Nightthorn with minimal ceremony and maximum practicality. A horse, traveling supplies, enough coin to survive but not enough to cushion, and a letter of introduction from Cerys that identified him as former military strategist available for consultation but bound by no official authority. He rode east, then north, following no particular route except away from what had been toward what might be. The territories he passed through showed signs of the Empire's recent struggles: burned villages being rebuilt, trade routes slowly reopening, people working with the determined efficiency of those who'd survived and now had to figure out how to live. In a small town at the edge of the northern territories, he stopped at an inn that served decent food and asked few questions. The innkeeper, a woman in her 50s with hands scarred from hard work, showed him to a simple room and mentioned almost casually that the town council had been trying to resolve a border dispute with a neighboring settlement, but lacked anyone with legal or military expertise to mediate effectively. Vaelor listened, understanding that this was the kind of problem that once would have been beneath his notice. Small, local, absent the grand stakes of empire. He offered to help anyway. Not as former king, not as someone important, just as someone who knew how to navigate disputes and had nothing better to do with skills that were otherwise growing useless. The mediation took 3 days. Both sides presented grievances that were legitimate and complicated and human in ways that palace politics never quite achieved. Vaelor listened, asked questions, helped them find compromise that neither side loved but both could accept. When it was done, the town council paid him modestly and thanked him genuinely, and he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, not pride in domination, satisfaction in usefulness. It was small, almost insignificant measured against empires ruled and wars won, but it was real. And real, he was learning, mattered more than grand. A year passed, then 2, measured not in conquests or political victories, but in small problems solved and towns helped, and the slow accumulation of a reputation as someone reliable who asked no questions about the past and delivered results in the present. Vaelor moved through the northern territories like a ghost of who he'd been, recognizing occasionally the faces of former soldiers or nobles who'd served during his reign but never acknowledging the connection unless they did first. Most didn't. Either they didn't recognize him without the crown, or they chose not to, granting him the anonymity that exile required. In the 3rd winter after his abdication, he found himself in a mountain town so remote that news from the capital arrived weeks late and largely irrelevant. The inn was warm, the locals were friendly in the cautious way of people who'd learned to be suspicious of outsiders, and the work available was honest, if not particularly rewarding. He was helping the local smith repair a grain mill when a traveler arrived, and Vaelor recognized her before she'd fully dismounted. Elira looked older in ways that had nothing to do with years and everything to do with experience survived. Her face carried lines that hadn't existed during their time in the palace, and her eyes held the kind of clarity that came from having destroyed things and rebuilt yourself from the wreckage. They stared at each other across the town square, recognition and surprise and something too complicated for simple naming. She approached slowly, and when she spoke, her voice carried no accusation, no longing, just honest curiosity. "You're fixing mills now? Someone has to. The smith is getting old and the town needs grain processed." Vaelor wiped grease from his hands, aware he probably looked nothing like the king she'd once known. "What brings you this far north?" "I've been traveling, learning languages, studying different governance systems, trying to understand what I want to contribute beyond destruction." She smiled slightly. "Turns out there's value in obscurity. And being just a person with skills rather than a person with a history everyone wants to weaponize. Have you found it? What you wanted to contribute? Maybe. I've been consulting with trade guilds on improving supply chain efficiency. It's not romantic, but it helps people eat more reliably. That seems worth doing." They sat on the inn's front steps, watching the mountain town continue its daily rhythms around them. Children playing, merchants negotiating, life happening with beautiful, mundane persistence. "Do you regret it?" Elira asked eventually. "Everything that happened?" Vaelor considered the question with the honesty that obscurity allowed. "I regret Cassian's pain. I regret the Empire's instability. I regret that feeling something real required destroying things that mattered. But I don't regret learning I was human, even if the education cost more than it should have. That's not the same as regret. No. It's something more complicated. Acceptance, maybe. Of being flawed in ways that can't be undone, only learned from." They sat in comfortable silence. Two people who'd destroyed and been destroyed, and somehow found ways to continue that didn't require the intensity that had nearly killed them both. "I loved you," Elira said quietly. "That was real. It just wasn't sustainable. The recognition we gave each other, that sense of being completely seen, it was true. It was also toxic. Because we saw each other so clearly, we forgot everyone else existed." "I know. Do you love me still?" The question hung between them like something fragile. "Yes," Vaelor admitted, "but differently. Not with the desperate intensity that made us dangerous to everyone around us. More like how you love something you've survived, with respect for what it was, and relief that it's over." Elira nodded slowly. "That's maybe the healthiest thing I've heard you say." They talked through the afternoon and into evening, comparing notes on the lives they'd built from ruins, the work they'd found meaningful, the people they were becoming when no crown or marriage or forbidden connection defined them. When she prepared to leave the next morning, continuing her journey east toward consulting work in the border territories, they embraced briefly and honestly. No promises of future meetings, no dramatic declarations, just acknowledgement that they'd been part of each other's education and what it meant to be human beyond roles and authority and the seductive intensity of recognition purchased through betrayal. She rode away, and Vaelor returned to the grain mill, understanding that love, real love, sustainable love, the kind that built rather than destroyed, required something they'd never had together: distance, growth, and the willingness to let someone matter without needing to possess them. 5 years after his abdication, Vaelor received a letter forwarded through several intermediaries before reaching the coastal town where he'd been helping establish better fishing practices and harbor defenses against winter storms. The seal was Cassian's, and Vaelor's hands shook slightly, opening it, wondering what final judgment was being delivered after all this time. The letter was brief, written in Cassian's efficient military hand. "Vaelor, I'm told you're alive and working somewhere on the coast. I'm told you've been useful to various towns and settlements, solving problems without claiming authority. I'm told you've become someone different from who you were. I'm writing not to forgive you, that's still beyond me and may always be, but to acknowledge that time and distance have given me perspective. You destroyed my faith, yes, but in forcing me to rebuild without that faith, you inadvertently gave me something more durable. I've learned to trust actions over words, to value competence over loyalty, to build relationships based on mutual benefit rather than assumed obligation. You taught me that through maximum pain, and I still hate you for the method. But I can't deny the education had value. This isn't reconciliation. We'll never be brothers in arms again. But it is acknowledgement that even our worst mistakes can become someone else's unlikely education if they're strong enough to extract wisdom from pain. Survive well. That's not forgiveness. It's just recognition that your continuing existence might matter to someone beyond yourself. Cassian. Vaelor read the letter 3 times, understanding that this was as close to peace as they would ever achieve. Not friendship restored, not trust rebuilt, just mutual acknowledgement that they'd both survived and learned and become something different from what they'd been. It was enough. Not satisfying in any romantic sense, but true in ways that mattered more than satisfaction. 7 years after abdication, on a spring morning when the world felt temporarily gentle, Vaelor stood on a cliff overlooking the northern sea and took inventory of the life he'd built from wreckage. He was 50 now, graying and scarred and entirely absent from any historical record beyond footnotes about a king who'd abdicated during crisis. The empire continued under Cerys's competent rule, stable and prosperous in ways it never had been during his reign. Cassian commanded the southern territories with honor and effectiveness. Illyra consulted throughout the eastern regions, valued for her intelligence and careful to never leverage past connections for present gain. And he was here, on this cliff, having spent 7 years solving small problems and helping small towns and learning that mattering didn't require being remembered. The work was modest. The impact was local. The legacy would be forgotten. But the life was honest in ways that ruling an empire never had been. Here's what Vaelor learned slowly and painfully over years of exile and obscurity. Power doesn't make you free. It makes you a prisoner to the performance of power, to the constant need to demonstrate dominance, to the exhausting maintenance of control that mistakes submission for loyalty and fear for respect. Real freedom came from having nothing that could be taken except your life, and even that loss eventually seemed less terrifying than the alternative of never learning who you were beneath the crown. He'd been a terrible king, that was true. He'd prioritized control over care, dominance over connection, authority over accountability. But he'd become a decent man. Not exceptional, not worthy of legend or redemption arc. Just someone who'd learned through maximum cost that mattering to a few people genuinely was worth more than being feared by thousands emptily. The crown had taught him how to rule. Exile had taught him how to live. And between those two educations, he discovered that the second was infinitely more valuable than the first. A bell rang in the town below, signaling midday and the opening of the small school where Vaelor had been helping teach basic mathematics to children whose futures would be determined not by royal birth, but by whatever skills they could develop and whatever opportunities they could create. He descended from the cliff, heading toward work that was humble and necessary and his. The empire would continue without him. History would forget him or remember him poorly. And somewhere in that obscurity, Vaelor had finally found what 17 years of ruling had never provided. Not power, not recognition, just the quiet dignity of being useful without needing to be important. It wasn't redemption. Redemption suggested erasing the past or balancing scales that couldn't be balanced. It was just growth. The slow, unglamorous work of becoming someone who wouldn't make the same mistakes again, knowing the growth mattered primarily to yourself and accepting that as sufficient. The crown had survived. The empire had survived. And he had survived to learn that survival's value wasn't measured in territories held or victories won, but in the daily choice to be slightly better than you'd been, slightly more honest than you'd been, slightly more human than the role had ever permitted. That was enough. Not satisfying in any storybook sense, but true. And truth, finally, was the only authority that mattered.